Hello and welcome to Film Ireland. Today we have a very special guest in David McGiffert, prolific first assistant director of many Hollywood films that you'll be very familiar with. Some of David's work includes the Back to the Future trilogy, Batman Returns, Witness, An Officer and a Gentleman, Songwriter, Honeysuckle Rose, Made in Heaven, The Firm, and Vanilla Sky. I sat down with David to discuss his career in depth and get an insight into what life is like on a Hollywood set for a first assistant director. Starting with the likes of Transfer, these very kind of experimental and avant-garde films, right up until the end of your career on All the King's Men and The Interpreter, and you went through that 80s and 90s period of working on these very, very big established studio films, the likes of Back to the Future trilogy, Witness, Bright Lights, Big City, Made in Heaven, all these films that I love and adore. So it's intriguing to me to kind of listen to your insight on the making of some of those films. But first of all, tell me about how you got into the film industry and at what point.
I was in my, it was 1969. I was out of college. I'd been working in a clothing store on the Sunset Strip, trying to figure out what in the world I wanted to do. The last thing on my mind was the film business. It was all around me as I grew up. It never occurred to me that that might be something I could do. A friend of mine who had just graduated SC Film School called me up and asked me if I wanted to be the second assistant director on a film that he was working on. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I told him that I didn't know what he meant. He said, "Don't worry about it. Just come to work with me. I'll tell you what you have to do. And we'll take it from there. You and I are friends. We communicate well. It'll work out great." I was naive enough to believe him. 2 weeks later, he quit this film over a salary dispute. And I was suddenly given a job that I had no knowledge of whatsoever. I didn't know anything about the film business. I didn't know how filming worked. I didn't know anything about how the set worked. And suddenly it dropped into my lap. The director of this film, his name is Tony Fouts. He actually lives in Ireland now. He had written this film, he was directing it, Doug Trumbull was producing it, and he said, "Look, I will try to get you up to speed. I've been an assistant director before in Italy. I worked with Pontecorvo and a lot of directors. I know how the job works. If you can stay up with me, I'll try to tell you what you need to do to help me, but if you can't keep up, I have to get somebody who can help me." And I faked my way through the last few weeks of shooting for that film. I went on to, then I was living behind Peter Fonda's film office in Hollywood. He had an editing room. I was living back there. And I somehow met another number of people. Right next to me was Conrad Hall and Haskell Wexler's office building. So the interchange of people running back and forth were all film people. And I got a job on Peter Fonda's film called Idaho Transfer that he was going to shoot in Idaho, obviously, and the interiors in Seattle. But I was the set PA in Los Angeles, mainly in charge of picking up the film at the airport, taking the dailies to the lab, the next morning picking up the dailies, going back to the airport, sending them up so they could watch the dailies. About 3 weeks into filming, they were now back in Seattle shooting interiors. I get a phone call from their production office asking me if it would be okay if I got on a plane the next morning and came up and took over as the first assistant director. After I picked myself up off the floor, I said, "Of course," and tried to sound casual. I could hardly find the words to speak. And Wayne, the guy who had quit that job was the same guy who had originally hired me on the first film. So here's this person who quit 2 films, actually been the impetus to get me into the film business. Is so odd to me. I never saw him again. And suddenly they said, "Oh, would you mind booking another seat beside you when you fly up? We're going to fly you first class, but we need a seat beside you so that you can bring up Peter Fonda's guitar." That's how I started. And Peter and I were immediately in sync. We were very intuitive together. I began to see how he worked, and I tried to work ahead of him. I was now kind of getting the idea of sort of what I had to do on a film, which basically maybe we'll go into at a later point, but it's essentially being the hub of a wheel on the set for information. And I finished the film with them. I still didn't really understand the full import of what I was doing, but I was getting so I could fake it better.
And was it only in the likes of this period in Hollywood, this new Hollywood era, where, you know, an Idaho Transfer was an independently made film as well, wasn't it? So, I mean, you weren't coming out of the old Hollywood system, so it was completely new to you. And I presume that, you know, in the likes of this milieu where it's Peter Fonda funding a film with his own money, and that's the way things can happen, that you can just be given a job like that, you know.
It's true. And Peter was flush from Easy Rider and The Hired Hand. So they did have a lot of money. He was also someone that people wanted to work with. He hired all these young kids. He had a kid from a bike shop that he took his bicycle into to be the lead in the film. I mean, that's kind of how it was then. It wasn't going through casting agencies and having these big casting calls, and it was completely, basically off the street, and I include myself in that. So as this was now, that was in the late 60s and early 70s. And on the way from like 71 to 75, I met the first in a great series of mentors that I've had. And I have to say that an assistant director's career sounds like something that I've done. But, you know, directors hire assistant directors. When you're in the director's guild, it is the director's prerogative who they hire. They can take suggestions from people, but they do it. So my career, as it were, has been mostly on the coattails of directors and producers. And it's important to point that out because I'm very humbled by that. And so anyway, I met this person named Brian Frankish, who was a wild man. He was completely in love with film, like you are, I think. He knew the history of it. He watched films. He thought about films. From all the different aspects. And he hired me to be his PA on a commercial that he was the producer of. And as we got to know each other, he became my touchstone for information and for learning. And literally, he taught me the most of anyone that I've ever met in the film business. We're still friends. We still talk. And when I went away on another independent film with him called Haunts that was done in Mendocino for $3. You know, I mean, just ridiculous. There were 5 of us living in the same room. It was Aldo Ray, Cameron Mitchell, Mai Britt, the end of an era of those people. We had to literally get a key made to Aldo Ray's room so that we could unlock the door in the mornings and wake him up because he was drinking a lot in those days. Yeah. It was very down to earth, very grab it and go filmmaking, but it became a film. I'd also gotten into editing along the way, and I just finished editing a documentary that I also shot, believe it or not, a lot of the episodes, including an episode underwater with Jacques Cousteau's son, who I'd never scuba dived before. I'd never shot underwater before. I learned to scuba dive in Sammy Davis's swimming pool. This is the kind of life that I was leading. Anyway, I'd finished editing this documentary, which was about James Stacy, who lost an arm and a leg in a motorcycle accident, won a huge lawsuit against the bar. And a lot of people, the bar that served him, that led to this accident. And a lot of people, they had a a charity performance for him and raised thousands of dollars, which he then put into a film about his recovery. And I got to shoot a lot of those episodes. Ida Lupino directed one of the episodes that I shot. Out of nowhere, you know, I'm meeting all these people. I think you can imagine the overwhelming growth curve that was going on. I mean, I was working for Albert Brooks, editing his Saturday Night Live short films. Albert Brooks would call me at 2:00 in the morning and say, David, what are you doing right now? And I go, well, Albert, I'm asleep. And he go, well, hey, what do you say you come over? I got a few ideas I'd like to talk to you about. Do you mind? It's, you know, what do you think? And I'd meet him at 2:30 or 3 in the morning. He'd be loaded and he'd drive around in the car and talk to me about all these ideas that he wanted to do. I was on the floor of the car laughing. He's the funniest man I've ever met. I also met a woman named Penelope Spheris, who is, at the point I met her, she was directing early versions of music videos. We did one at the record plant with Ry Cooder that was just this amazing experience of this unbelievable musician with these band people, and we were up there for days. I was the dolly grip and the assistant editor. Then through Penelope, I met Albert, because Penelope was producing the short films that Albert was writing and directing and acting in. And she said, well, what do you think? You want to edit some of these? They're pretty simple. You know, you just cut them together and, you know, and I said, of course. So that was part of how I learned editing. Then came the Jim Stacy project. All the time in the background was Brian Frankish hiring me for different things. He said, go to LA airport, 9:30, wait outside United Airlines, hold up a sign that says Chuck, you know. And so I did. And I'm riding home, taking Chuck Berry to his hotel. You know, who's pissed off that he doesn't have a limo picking him up as some guy in a Volkswagen bus, you know, like, so, but he was very sweet. We had a nice conversation on the freeway, but I mean, these things were dropping in my lap from everywhere. Then Brian calls me as I had finished. I was literally in Malibu at a rented house. I edited this film of Jim Stacy, and we had to cut the wall off the house to get an editing machine in the room that he wanted to edit in. And I just finished it. We were talking about it, and I said, I'm sorry, I have to call somebody. I'll be right back, Jim. And for no reason that I can think of to this day, I got up and called Brian's office. He had just been hired as the location manager on Dila De Laurentiis's King Kong. He said, my God, thank God you called. He said, I've been trying to get a hold of you. Look, they need a location scout. Look, David, this is a real film. You're going to have to cut your hair. My hair was as long as yours. He said, you're going to have to cut your hair. He said, but this is a good job. You got to come in here and meet this guy, Jack Grossberg, who is the production manager, basically. I said, I'm not cutting my hair. I mean, why do I have to do that? Can't I just come in? He said, God, he said, you're so stubborn. I said, it's my hair. I went in, Jack looked me over, he hired me. So I went from location scout on King Kong. I became a member of the DGA. Jack Grossberg called me into his office and said, I'm putting you as the second AD on the second unit. They're doing miniatures and stuff. Go over there, ask a lot of questions. It'll be good for you to learn. You're in the DGA now, so go do that. I did that for 2 weeks, and then he made me the first assistant of the second unit. I worked on the second unit on all kinds of things like the aerial shots of the tanker. I had to go to the Beverly Hills Hotel and they said, you have to go take a Polaroid camera. There's a girl there that we're thinking is going to be in the movie. They want pictures of her to see if her headshots are going to work for stuff and how she looks and her look and stuff. She's staying in the hotel. Just go up and ask for her. Well, it was Jessica Lange. So I'm in there taking Polaroid pictures of Jessica Lange. And she's cool. She's, she wanted to know what was going on in her life because Dina De Laurentiis had her holed up in this hotel for a week and she hadn't been able to even go out. She was a secret. And they hired her on the film. So I was on the second unit for a few months, and then both units went to New York. The first unit went to obviously shoot all the scenes in the World Trade Center and on the streets of Wall Street between Jessica and Jeff Bridges. And I went with the second unit to shoot background plates for a lot of the special effects shots that we were doing in the miniatures. And so they were shooting out of a helicopter at night. And I was asleep at 10 o'clock in the morning. I'd been up all night, and the phone rang in my hotel room, and a woman from De Laurentiis' office asked me if I could come down, that Mr. De Laurentiis wanted to speak to me. And my heart froze, and I said, of course. And I was pretty sure I was being fired, although I couldn't figure out why, but that's how I felt as I walked into De Laurentiis' office a couple of hours later. And there was a room full of director John Gillerman, 2 production managers, 2 producers, Fred Sidewinder, De Laurentiis' partner, and De Laurentiis sitting behind this gigantic desk looking at me as I came in the door with a little chair in front of his desk in the middle of the room, like I was going to be interrogated. And so he pointed to the chair, and I sat down and he cleared his throat and he said, David, we were wondering whether you would be able to take over the film tonight on the first unit. But we need you to do that. Would you be available to do that? And I went blank. I looked around at everybody in the room as my mind was freewheeling. And I stumbled out, yes, and he said, very good. That's all. We'll send a car for you. Jack, what time is his call? I mean, literally, it was that short, that big a flash, and suddenly I was tossed on to the first unit of King Kong in the World Trade Center with, the second night I was there, we had 20,000 extras, background people.
What's the experience like to go from those kind of small movies where there's, it's a different culture almost, I presume, on the set and the way things are run, to this massive studio film?
Yeah. Well, when I look back on it now, it terrifies me to realize how much I didn't know. When I say that I had a 33-year learning curve, I mean it. I really started from below zero. But a wonderful thing about assistant directing, which is hard to convey, I don't hear people talk about it, but when you are speaking on behalf of a director or on behalf of a crew, you disappear. And you become empowered with representing these people who are doing, those people are making the film. An assistant director is not making the film. An assistant director is watching a crew and a cast and a director make the film. You're facilitating what they do. And I loved that job because it was a people job. And so I could go around to all these people, interact with them, watch what they were doing, begin to understand what they were doing had so much to do with what wound up in the film, although you would never hear about it. The costume designers, the set decorators, the grips, the electricians, especially, all these unbelievable people. There are not many stupid people in the film business. That's the first thing. There are also, people don't brook screwing up. You have to be able to do what you're hired to do so that you don't make, if you're a grip, if you screw up, you make the grips look bad. That's not okay. And also you work right, and that's key to where you're there. So all these things were happening in a cascade. I remember being overwhelmed a lot, but the rush of activity and information and the urgency to get things done literally propelled me into my work.
After that, you reconnected with Albert Brooks and Penelope Spheris on Real Life. which is actually one of my favorite films that you've worked on, and a very prescient film considering what has come of reality TV and all that kind of thing. You know, what was that like? What was, when you guys were making that, did this seem like such a science fiction concept? You know,
it seemed like exactly like Albert Brooks's world. Albert Brooks put a spin on that story, and that, you know, there were, as you said, you know, there were reality documentaries starting to come out about family life and stuff like that. But his spin on, and Charles Grodin in the same film with them, these two crazy people. And I mean, I could do a whole show on Charles Grodin and how wonderful he is and how funny he is. But their humor is completely different. They play off each other in great ways. And Albert, I don't know how to describe him because he's brilliant. But you know, his way of working is very off the top of his head, seemingly. It probably isn't, but it, you know, and now we're going to go and, you know, and so we were all running the whole time, but I can just remember his spontaneity. I mean, Albert and Robin Williams are the two people I've met who, as they work, seem to build up an electrical charge that must be released. And for Albert, that would come sometimes in the middle of a take. He would suddenly say a line of dialogue or something, and it would send him off on a riff that we would just turn the camera off and stand around and let him come out with this comedic train of thought that he had. And we would wind up rolling on the floor laughing. I'm not joking about that. The man was so incredibly funny. And he gave that sense of, you never knew what was going to happen next to the film. And I think also to the supposed documentary that he was filming, right? It had this kind of off balance feeling all the way through that I thought sort of worked for the film.
Yeah. And it's strange to look at it now and to know where reality TV went in the ensuing decades. It's amazing to see all those, like, the, you know, really egging on the kind of the conflict within the household and all that for ratings, really, at the end of the day. You know, that kind of...
I always wished that I had asked him where he got the idea. I didn't have time. I met him, we had meetings, and we started shooting. But I always wanted to know, where did that idea come from? Did he see something that reminded him of it, or did he come up with it? Because his the font of ideas that came to Albert was really quite unusual. You don't meet many people like that ever.
And then soon after that, you made a collaboration with another filmmaker and an actor who you'd go on to work with several occasions. And that was Sydney Pollack and Paul Newman on Absence of Malice. Yes. I don't know how I got the call about the film, but I heard, you know, Sydney Pollack obviously is a gigantic name. I remember being very intimidated to go in and talk to him. His office was at Columbia Studios, which was adjacent to Warner Brothers. I drove in and I went into the production manager's office. His name was Ron Swery. He's recently passed away, but that was another phenomenal man in my life. Just a wonderful, unusual person to have in that position of a unit manager. Very unexpectedly humanistic, and crews just loved him. The only person I ever heard at the Academy Award that thanks his crew when he got an Academy Award for Ordinary People that he also line produced. But Ron called me into his office. He said, "Look, don't go in and bullshit Sydney. You know, go in, be yourself. Let him figure out if he wants to work with you, but don't try to kid him about anything." And so I walked in, and you know, it's kind of like meeting my dad in a way. It felt like, I mean, he was very authoritative, very in command, extremely good with the language. So everything he said was put in an interesting way. He wouldn't say casual stuff like we do, you know,
like, or anything. He didn't speak like that. He spoke the language. And I happened to mention there were some beautiful watercolors on his wall. And I happened to mention that, my mother was a watercolorist, and those look like they were done by somebody who knows what they're doing. And he went off into a 10-minute talk about his art director who had done these watercolors that he had framed and put up on his wall, and how he went on a whole riff about watercolors, the technique of it, why they were so good for imparting ideas, that the paintings helped so much better than photographs and design drawings, and on and on and on. And so that turned into a conversation about art and stuff. And it was very easy and very conversational. I found I was relaxed after a while. I was absolutely ready to fall over when I walked in, but as we went on, I relaxed, and I also started realizing that he was talking to me as though I was his assistant director, and started talking about some ideas about absence and malice and what he was trying to portray. And when I walked out, he never said it, but I was his assistant director.
So you came across quite authoritative, even just in your meeting. And was he like that on set as a director?
Oh, absolutely. He knew everybody's job. Sometimes people got a little upset about that because they would always walk in and say, well, really, do you you're going to use that microphone? I mean, don't you think maybe, if you use these kind of directional microphones, it might be a little better? And the sound people would be looking at each other. He knew what he wanted, how he wanted it. He understood story structure. Most directors do, but Sydney really did. He understood it from a classical point of view. He'd studied it. He came from the stage. He'd had a lot of experience with the stage. He'd been trained as an actor. So he understood from an actor's point of view how to bring what he needed to the performance. He understood camera angles. If there was anything about Sydney that I always wondered about, it was that his camera work was a bit staid to me in the midst of an industry that was really coming to terms with the different ways you could use the camera to tell the story. So, but I didn't notice that at the time, but I do as I look back, that usually there was the same way that he shot his films. It didn't matter who he had. Owen Roisman was usually his director of photography. And I got along well with Owen. An assistant director has to get along with the DP. That's really important because the two of you are who do the behind the scenes scheming, to get what the director wants and to get what the crew needs to fall in line. And sometimes they're at odds a little bit. But Sydney did treat me like he was my dad in a way. He was very tough on the set, not demeaning, but he expected what he wanted when he wanted it, and that worked well for me. I liked that. I liked that challenge, and we had good crew, so it wasn't really a problem. These guys were like, if I wasn't there, they could have still done the job, is the way I felt at the time. But I was there and I was learning. And Sydney and I got along personally, gradually. I broke through the dad part and we became people who talked back and forth about things from the heart and things that we were concerned with as people, not just the film out there. But as soon as the film was over, it was as though I'd never met him. I never heard from him ever until the next time he wanted to use me. But I learned a lot from Sydney.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the visual side of his films there, because this was the beginning of the 80s. So we're coming out of that whole new Hollywood era, which had broken the classical standard golden age method of filmmaking. Films were becoming a bit more, thematically, they were becoming a bit more socially aware, a bit more politically aware, but also aesthetically, they were so different because they had a certain almost realism that was occurring, that you'd see likes of Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy in the last movie, where they were quite avant-garde aesthetically and artistically. They weren't in the classical mold. So you were coming out of that 70s milieu into the 80s, which were, you know, it was getting a bit more, I guess, commercial again. Films were probably becoming aesthetically a bit more conservative in terms of the way they were shot. I mean, we didn't see many Easy Riders in the 1980s. You know, they weren't too experimental.
No, but what I did see was studio films trying to emulate what was brought out by those independent films, but emulate it in a more upgraded way. I mean, so you know, these, you know, they would work in ways that would give you the feel, the movement of an independent film, but then the lighting specificity of a studio film. Yeah. You know, they weren't just blasting in reflectors or catching available light or whatever. It was, you know, it was still a film for big screen. So it was an interesting mix, actually.
Yeah, and I think Sydney's films, when I look at them from a visual point of view, they do remind me a little bit more of the classical era in the way they're shot. You know,
very much so,
more traditional, and in particular, like Tootsie, which feels like a classic comedy of old, anyway. You know, and it's one that's lasted. Were you ever aware of, or does it ever occur to you when you're working on a film that this is going to endure, this is going to last? Do you ever get that feeling on a movie, something like which Tootsie has?
Tootsie had inherent in it, when the film started, problems. And so most of the film was spent trying to keep up with the problems. The script was unfinished. They hadn't worked out how Dustin's makeup worked. How in the world were they going to make this crazy looking guy a believable? That metamorphosis went on for half the film before they locked into the look they liked. There were really a lot of things that were going on at the time. There was contention between Sydney and Dustin. It's kind of famous. But the reason for that were two things. One was Sydney usually had control of his films. But on Tootsie, because Dustin had been a longtime promoter of it, they had to share legally and contractually those producing assignments equally. So that was one thing. The other thing was that they thought entirely differently. Sydney knew what he wanted, was following the arc of the story. Dustin wanted every scene to be the best one in the movie. I mean, I think I've talked about that with you before a little bit. He'd come in, he'd say something spontaneously that was way off the mark for the script, but it was so hilariously funny that you then had to back up and try to find a way to incorporate it. They were at loggerheads a lot. Sydney and Dustin argued, sometimes in front of people, sometimes away, but it always had this shockwave that went through the crew. It was very tense on the set a lot of times, but that would immediately be supplanted with something outrageous that Dustin did that would make you, as you were asking, make you feel like, wait a minute, this thing is unusual. This has something going for it. Who the hell is this person? Dustin loved being that woman. He reveled in it. He learned from it. I caught him on the weekend shopping with his wife, dressed as Tootsie. He was on the street. And I just happened to pass him whatever you do on a weekend when you're blown out, you know, and I saw them walk by and I couldn't believe it. And he, you know, and then we talked about it after. He said, I was in these dressing rooms, you know, learning, you know, how these women work. And he said, it was unbelievable. He said, I'm having the best time. Don't tell anybody. He saw Fernando Lamas. Do you remember Fernando Lamas? Famous actor, yep. Womanizer, big time womanizer. We were shooting on 57th Street in New York. He was dressed as Tootsie. He saw Fernando Lamas get out of a car and go into a building. And we were taking a break between setting up something. He made a beeline for the building. And I found out after that he'd followed Fernando Lamas into the elevator with some other people that were with him. And Dustin jumped into the elevator and kind of came on to Fernando Lamas in the elevator. And and Fernando Lamas apparently got off the elevator. Dustin didn't get off with him, and said, who is that ugly, weird woman?" when he got off the elevator. And Dustin was very put out. But he told us about it after, and he said, "Man, it was so cool." He said Fernando didn't know what to do. He said, "I was coming on and he was freaking out. It was so great."
That's fantastic. And then when you get to see the finished product then, because as you say, as you're watching these scenes being shot and you're thinking, God, there's something special going on here. When you got to see the finished film then, did it affirm to you that it really was, or what was the initial reaction from people when you saw the final version?
Well, what happened in the midst of their arguments as to how to portray scenes was that finally Sydney came up with two things. One was that after he'd done every setup that he'd done, he gave Dustin a freebie. He said, "You can do anything that you want to do now that I've got what I think I need. You do a take, you do whatever the hell you want, and I promise you," and he said this in front of the crew, "I promise you, if it works for the film, I will put it in." And Dustin was good for that. The other thing that happened, and I will take credit for this, we began to fall behind schedule because there were so many difficulties, and it was early on. And so we had a series of meetings with the production people, who would supposedly help this thing. We were all sitting around trying to figure out what we could do to help break the log jams that were happening. And I was musing half out loud, and I was saying, it's just too bad, we can't talk to Dorothy because she's so sweet, and Sydney just, wait a minute. And he picked up on it right away, and he said, "Wait a minute, why don't we try that? Why don't we talk to Dustin when he's dressed up as Dorothy about the script changes that he always says no to?" And a few days later, there was a script change that Sydney wanted. Dustin came out of the dressing room on the way to rehearsal dressed as Dorothy. I talked to him about the script change that Sydney had been thinking about and what did he think about it. And Dustin, as Dorothy in her Southern accent, said, "Oh my, yes, by all means, let's do that." And we used that all the way through the film when we needed to. We waited till he was dressed as Dorothy. We would go to him with the idea, and 90% of the time, he would immediately agree to it. If it had been Dustin, or if it had been playing the out-of-work actor, he was wired to say no. It was just a weird, I don't know how that worked, but that was those are the little miraculous things that happen behind the scenes on a film that make a difference. That one happened to do with me, but there are lots of them all the time. It's not just me. There's a lot of people with a lot of ideas. Yeah. But yes, so when the film came out, you could see that Sydney had taken the best that Dustin came up with, along with mostly the best of what he thought was good, and they had collaborated and made a film that worked.
That's terrific. And you worked with Dustin again on probably one of your most celebrated films, which is Rain Man. And that was through Sydney Pollack. Am I wrong that it was started off as a Sydney Pollack film?
No, you're right. That's how I was hired. It was my second film as an associate producer, which means that and a nickel will get you a cup of coffee. It doesn't really mean anything money-wise. It's an extra little credit that says you have a little bit more to do with the film than perhaps not having that after your name. But so I was hired by Sydney to do this. They had a hard out date because Dustin and Tom both had films that I think they were contracted to do. So it was under a bit of the gun. But 3 weeks later, Sydney told us that he was bowing out of the film. Right. and that he'd been unable to solve some of the problems that came in with the script that he had gotten, and there wasn't enough time for him to work out the way that he needed it to work out. They had all kinds of crazy scenes in it when I first read it, that no wonder he had a problem. I mean, they got abducted by, they get abducted at one point by survivalists, you know, I mean, it's just, there was some crazy stuff in it. And he couldn't make it work. And for some, I don't know how Barry Levinson was brought into it or how his name came up, but at one point, the main crew people were put into a van wherever we were preparing the film, I can't remember, and we drove to Bel Air to Barry Levinson's house, and we were all ushered into his living room to meet Barry Levinson and talk about a little about what we knew of the film with Sydney there. And then it was up to Barry about whether he wanted to come on to direct it and to try to correct the writing also. And Barry, to his credit, took everybody, took Sydney's crew, never met us, and jumped into this film. Now, his cameraman was John Seal. Who's going to say no to that? Nobody. You know, I mean, he had really good people that Sydney had around him. But Barry understood the film right away. His twisted mind, whatever it was, but Barry jumped into that film and made it what it is. He understood the characters. He was a lot looser in his thinking, I think, than Sydney. And maybe that was a hindrance for Sydney. I'm not really sure about that, but you know, Sydney was not a loose person that way. He just wasn't. Barry was. Barry understood crazy stuff, and also understood enough about what Dustin was trying to do to allow that part to metamorphose over time. So much so that at the end of the film, we actually went back to Cincinnati and shot a couple of scenes that Dustin, now that he understood the character better at the end of the film, thought he could do a better job with. So Barry was the person who made that film. He understood it and opened it up and gave it this kind of crazy humanity that it actually winds up having, that you can't see at first when you think about a selfish guy trying to bag some money from his mentally disabled brother. You know, it just sounds so crazy. And it instead turned into, and the experience for the people on the film, the personal experiences that people brought to Rain Man. We did a poll partway through the film, and we found out that like 80% of everybody in the crew either knew someone who had a mental problem, had someone in their family who had a mental problem, or someone that, you know, a relative, someone they cared for. So they brought this sensitivity of you know, this empathy for people with these kinds of disabilities into the film from all sides, and you could feel it. You could feel it when they got ready to do a scene. That scene in the motel, in the motel where suddenly he finds out, you know, that Raymond is Rain Man. They did that in one take, and everybody had to run outside afterward and just go breathe, because we were all, you know, just so moved. It was quite an experience. And at that point, you could tell we had the film. We just, in one take, bang, we hit it.
And as the associate producer, what was your extra role or duties that you wouldn't normally?
Nothing.
Really?
Nothing. Well, I don't know if this would be worthy of an associate producer spot, but at one point the camera people came to me and they said, we have a problem. This is about the third week, and we were shooting at the mental home, you know, where Dustin was housed. And they said, you know, Barry is in such a hurry that a lot of times Dustin will do something that we're not ready for. It'll be spontaneous. He'll make a move somewhere, and in the rehearsals, we never block that out. And sometimes we can't get the focus perfect as he makes a darts across the frame or does something, and it's not always him, but usually that's what it is. And we want to make the film right too. And Barry says, no, it's fine. You know, he saw it on the monitor, it's fine. And he said, the guy said, it's not fine. And, you know, we need help. What do we do? So I said, let me just see what I can do. I was so honored that they even asked me, you know, because, you know, for the camera people to break out of their camaraderie to say outside, look, we need help on something, that's very rare. And so I knew that they trusted me. So I went to Dustin and I told Dustin what was, and I said, so what if they tell me they have a problem and I work out a signal with you, would you ask Barry for another take? Because Barry will never say no to you. And he said, absolutely. And he said, now let's go right away and talk to Tom. And the two of us went to Tom's trailer, kicked everybody out. And Dustin told Tom the same thing that the camera people had told me. Tom was like, absolutely. You know how Tom, absolutely. That was a done deal. We only used it maybe 5 or 6 times on the film, but that was, maybe I earned an associate producership for something like that. I don't know. It's supposed to mean something. To me, it didn't mean anything because I did the same thing I would have done on any film. But in the business, you know, these extra names mean something to people who don't really understand that it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And it is a film, I think, when you look back at it now, that, you know, everybody working on it was at their best. I mean, John Seal, Hans Zimmer's score, it's still a beautiful looking film, timeless looking film. You know, I think Hans Zimmer is the only thing, his music kind of dates it in that it's a very 80s score, but I think it's Hans at his best. I found him more interesting when he was working with synthesizers like that before he got into the big orchestral stuff later on, you know. But I think it's a film that stands up and is still celebrated. I mean, it's probably one I would imagine that you still get asked about quite a bit as you were. Well,
you know, I don't see too many people right now. I'm retired and I have been for quite a while, but I did watch it recently. You know, I wanted to see what was going on with it, and I found myself unexpectedly moved at certain points because I could remember, you know, the situation, standing there, seeing this happen in front of me. And one of them was the coffee shop, you know, where he drops the toothpicks, you know, the scene before where they're talking about pancakes and stuff. Both times we shot it, for some reason, both actors got unexpectedly moved by what they were doing, and the crew did too. And we couldn't really, you know, you couldn't really place it on any specific thing. It wasn't a particularly emotional scene, but it was like just the edges of each one breaking through to the other, I think, was the start of it. And that became a very important thing to be able to bring out in subtle ways that I didn't understand, honestly, until I saw the whole film put together. But, you know, the way Barry was able to bring that out in waves, kind of, and gradually enlarge on it, I thought was very well done. Yeah, you learn from a film like that, I think.
But there's another series of films that you've done, which will remain favorites for a long time to come, and that's the Back to the Future films. Just one of those films, or one of those series of films that have become legendary almost. You know, they're so beloved by multiple generations of viewers. Is that something that you felt when you were working on these films? Okay, this is something different, it's something new, and you have a visionary director in Robert Zemeckis. What was that whole experience like?
When I first read Back to the Future, I was sitting in my office at Universal, and I was looking at it from the point of view of an AD breaking down 1/8 of a page to schedule. And I was reading it literally for the first time in the office because they were very secretive about the script. I think it was called it had some bizarre name, code name that it wasn't even called Back to the Future when we were starting to shoot it. It had some weird like Blue Harvest or something. So I started reading it, and I'm marking down, you line out the script, right? And you put, this is 2/8 of a page. This is 1/8 of a page. This is, this has these props in it. And by about the third or fourth page, I wasn't lining out the script anymore. I wasn't thinking about eighths of a page. I was just reading this story. And by the time I got to the DeLorean, I was thinking, that thing could work. This seems like it could work. This is like, and I got just pulled into it. And I mean, I really remember that. I don't think I've done that with very many scripts. You don't get, you're very kind of academic about it when you're breaking down a script. I mean, that's what you're there to do. You're not there to say, oh God, I love this, But I did. I read that like I was reading something that for pleasure. I couldn't believe how cool it was. And so then when we began filming it, and they had Eric Stoltz as Marty McFly, after a long and arduous series of casting sessions that actually went on to the detriment of preparing the film. They were having such trouble trying to find the right character. And Universal, Sid Sheinberg in particular, who was heading Universal at the time, was very high on Eric Stoltz because of the film The Mask that Eric had just finished, which was an amazing piece of acting. And they were convinced that Eric Stoltz was going to be a major star. And he probably should have been more than he is, because he is a fantastic actor. But he was not Marty McFly. And none of us really thought about it in that way when we began filming with him. Nobody ever spoke of it. This was who it was going to be, so that was who it was. And we began bending our take of the script to the person who was doing the part. But, he was very method. Everybody on this set had to call him Marty. You couldn't say, Eric, could you move over here? We just want to adjust this one part. No, it had to be Marty, could you? And he was very kind of deep into motivations of things that were giving him angst about the way he was portraying things and where did this come from. And nobody really, this happens, that this is part of filmmaking. This is part of what you incorporate it. This is what these people need. This is what you do. So we were all doing it, accommodating everything, except for Bob. And I didn't know Bob well by then at that point. But after a couple of weeks, I could tell Bob had a subtle sense of discomfort with certain things that were going on. And he never said anything. He never gave me like the look, like never, it was never anything like that. But I would watch him with the actors. I would watch him go and talk to Dean Cundy, the cinematographer. I'd watch him just approach the scenes. And there was something in him that just seemed a little off balance. Well, it turns out, that I think it was 4.5 weeks into filming, they cut together the film that they had, the sequences that they had done, and they went to Spielberg, and Bob Gale, his co-writer and co-producer, and Neil Canton, the other producer, went to Stephen with the cut footage. They said, Stephen, look, please look at this with us. What do you see? And Stephen went, he's not funny. He's not working. And they said, that's what we think. So they all went to Sid Sheinberg and outlined what was going on, and so showed Sid the film. And to Sheinberg's credit, he agreed. And so they decided that they had to make a change. At the same time, Michael Fox working on, what was it? Family Ties,
yeah,
right? A very heavy workload. And they had gone to a Family Ties producer, I can't remember his name, at the beginning of the film and said, look, we'd really like Michael to be in this film. We could work something out? And he said, I can't. You know, there were reasons for it, and they were good reasons. They weren't just being selfish about it. There were good reasons for the fact that Michael couldn't. I think it was because the mom in that program was pregnant, so they had to bend a lot of the films toward Michael, a lot of the filming Michael. So there's a more of a workload on him than normal. But after 4 or 5 weeks, they went back to this producer, explained to them the problem. The problems on their set had cleared to a great extent, and they were able to come to make a deal that Family Ties could have Michael during the day, and if Michael agreed to it, we could have him in the late afternoons and evenings and nights. So we're shooting at the mall, where the car goes Back to the Future for the first time, and you see Doc unload the car and all those crazy shots. And we've been filming with Eric Stoltz, and in the middle of the night one night, they told us to take an extra long lunch hour. Everybody knew that by then something was up. Nobody knew specifically what, at least on the crew that I was working with. Everybody above the line, all the producers and everybody, they all knew, obviously. They'd had a hand in it. But they said, you know, they came to me and they said, look, take a long lunch. We'll explain everything. And we took an hour and a half or something. And then afterward, they gathered everybody in the crew together, and they explained that this was Eric Stoltz's last night, and that we would be shooting close-ups on Chris Lloyd for the rest of the night, talking off screen to an actor that we had never met before, who would be in a couple of days reporting to us, and we would pick up the filming again. And that was Michael Fox.
And what did it feel like then when you saw him stepping into that role? How did all of a sudden, did it make sense?
Immediately. That Bob Gale, the writer and producer, told me that the single most important moment on all 3 of the Back to the Future films was the moment that Bob Zemeckis introduced Michael Fox to the crew, because everything changed instantly. Michael radiated confidence, youthful enthusiasm, comedic deftness, and a complete ability to make the double shifts that he was doing look like it was the easiest thing in the world. He said, look, if I can't do it at this age, then I'm never going to be able to do it. Of course I can do this. I'm glad to come, and I'm so excited. And he went around to every person in the crew, shook hands, introduced himself, and just brought this sense of enthusiasm immediately. Immediately. The night we started working, you saw immediately the change. Bob's face changed. Bob Zemeckis' face just changed. We all suddenly got it. You know, the only person who was confused by it all was Chris Lloyd, who never understood there was a problem at all. He was so into his part that none of that even intruded at all. It was amazing. And Michael picked up that film and ran with it. And we all ran with him. And Bob suddenly had a partner, you know. He suddenly had a partner in crime. And Michael delighted in his character, and brought who Michael was as a person to a lot of that stuff. And it made an immediate difference. And there's a sweetness about him that he never actually really shows, but it somehow comes through. And it gave it a universality. I think those 2 guys, you know, Chris and Michael, and I have to say, Tom Wilson, those 3 guys gave the film a universality somehow, that from whatever angle you were approaching the film from, you got all 3 of those guys. I just, that's my personal feeling. Tom Wilson brought, I mean, so much to the film, he's hardly ever mentioned. You know, people always think that he's Biff. You know, when you see Marty, you know that's Michael Fox playing that part. When you see Doc, you understand that's Chris Lloyd playing the part. When you see Biff, you don't see Tom Wilson in there. It's an amazing thing to me. And not a lot of people talk about that, but he was a cornerstone for the drama of that film. I mean, he anchored so many important things about it that I always am amazed. I mean, people love him and everything, but you know, he really brought a lot to that film, and he was the quietest. I mean, he never asked for anything. He never made a problem. I mean, it was almost as though he was invisible until suddenly he stepped onto the film and knocked you on your ass, you know? So.
And then you have the distinct, unique personality that is Crispin Glover in there as well. And I was going to ask, is he as distinct and unique outside of that character as he is in character?
Absolutely. Here's Crispin Glover for you. They told him he had the part. He was thrilled. He went home to his apartment, which I understand was painted black everywhere, and was talking about it with some of his friends. And on the spur of the moment, they all decided to go to London to celebrate.
As you do.
That was Crispin. He is a phenomenal actor. I mean, there's nothing you could ever take away from Crispin as far as that character goes. But man, oh man, did they have trouble shaping it, because he had all these ideas all the time, and they were not, I mean, they were good for him, the person, you know, but they didn't work for the rest of the film. And Bob really is constantly like, Crispin, come here a minute. You know, and you'd see Bob doesn't lose his temper. You know, he's very, but you could tell he had a couple of tells, you know, that he was getting uptight. And one of them was, you know, he'd straighten his coat in a weird way, you know, and Clyde Bryant, who was the camera assistant, the focus puller, the key to the film in a lot of ways. And I had this, we had this great kind of eye contact communication during the film. And Bob would like do something like that. I'd look over, Clyde be looking over at me, you know, it was like, mind the weather, you know, it's going to get stormy. And you know, Bob was challenged by Crispin. Crispin constantly kept Bob on edge. And I don't know, maybe it was good in one way, but by the end of the film, Bob was pretty much over it. It was pretty hard.
You mentioned Michael J. Fox and being perfect for Marty McFly, and you know, being so kind of so sweet, and he had that sense of humor, and that brings me back to another film that you worked on, also with Sydney Pollack, called Bright Lights, Big City, which is, I think, it's a very underrated film, but not your typical Michael J. Fox role. There is an element of, you know, his sweetness still there, but he's mining for some darkness in that film. But it's also beautifully shot by Gordon Willis, a stunning looking film. But that too had a difficult gestation, didn't it? And
oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah. Was Sydney Pollack at one stage going to direct that, or was he always just the producer?
Only the producer. But we started out, I can't remember her name. Her name was Joyce Chopra, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Because I was trying to remember this morning. Anyway, Joyce and her director of photography, James Glennon, they were the people who started Bright Lights, Big City. And I remember one of the scenes, we were shooting in a nightclub. And there's a very famous gaffer at that point in New York City named Dickie Quinlan. And I was with them set up the scene and trying to figure out when to bring the actors in, and the lighting was going on, and it was going on for quite a while. And Dickie Quinlan came over to me and he stood beside me and he said, I'd worked with him before. I can't remember on what, but he was very good at what he did. And he said, McGiffert, he said, I got to show you something. Just be casual with it, though, when you look. And I said, okay. He said, look at my light meter when I hold it up. He said, look at the foot candles that I have on the light meter. And so he held it up like he was taking a reading, and I was standing here and I was looking at it. The needle wasn't coming off the bottom mark. And I said, what's that all about? He says, I'm not really sure, but this is what I'm being told has to be. He said, so I make sure you're at the dailies. And I said, sure, okay. And we went on, we shot the scene. We went to the dailies. We were watching Merc. You couldn't make out what was going on in the scene. And this was what would you call it? An affectation that the two of them had. Sorry, Jim, but they were going to shoot the film the way they wanted. They knew how it had to be, and please don't start talking about it, that this was all under control. Well, the minute those dailies came up, there were some other small instances, but the minute those dailies came up, and this is an expensive place to shoot, and the actors, you know, had something difficult to do there, and you couldn't even tell what was going on, really. And there's no way to rescue it. I mean, they kept saying, oh no, we're going to flash the film, or we're going to do this or that. Well, you know, you can't flash what you don't have. And at that point, there have been other things going on with the directing too, the sense of directing. It was very, I don't know, it was an odd approach that way. And Sydney had a very difficult time. He had a great respect for other directors and had a very difficult time coming to the point that he realized that something had to change. But it was kind of obvious. And he wasn't present all the time, but he came at this particular point. And there was another point that he came, which I want to talk about because it was so crazy. We were shooting in a park close to Times Square, and it was probably 3/4 of a block square. And in the scene, it had to be deserted, but we were shooting it in the morning, not early, but mid-morning when the light was kind of okay. But there were subway station stops there where people getting off the subway came up and came across the park and on their way to work, and people were going on their way to work. It was very busy. And we had to literally stop everything. It was like a mini Times Square from Vanilla Sky, but we had to stop everything to get this shot of Michael Fox walking across the park by himself. Sydney came out to watch that shooting. Joyce was, lining up the shot, and we finally got everything held, and we had to roll right away. I said, Joyce, we got to go right now. I said, people want to fight my PAs down there. They want to get in fights and stuff. They're so pissed off about not being able to get out, please. She said, okay, just a minute. And Sydney said, shoot it, Joyce, right now. So we rolled the cameras, we shot it. And then she said, okay, now I'd like one more. And the place, when we let everybody go, it was just a sea of people. And there was no way that we were going to be able to get the same thing again. And Sydney said, no, you're not going to shoot it again. You're going to go on to your next shot. And that was the first time he'd ever kind of really spoken up. And he took her aside. It wasn't in front of the crew. But, and then we made a change. And Gordon Willis arrived. And the director, James Bridges, the change to those two guys, that was just like magic, everything changed. James was collaborative, funny, very dear, knew what he wanted. And Gordon Willis, of course, made sure that that Richard Brooks knew what he wanted. And Gordon Willis is just like, you could do a whole show on him. And that guy was, there are many more people who know much more about him than I do, but I love that guy. And I'd heard, he's very tough, and he was, but I'd also heard that he really liked an egg and bacon sandwich in the morning when he came to the set. So the very first day that he came to the set, I had a bacon and an egg sandwich that I actually took to him as I introduced myself to him. I said, I think this is what you need in the mornings, and hi, and if I can help, let me know. And he looked at me, he didn't even say anything really. It was like, and walked off. But they changed everything. When you're shooting on the streets with Michael Fox in New York in those days, we had it timed. You had 15 seconds that he could be out on the street before things got out of hand. So we would hide him in buildings and doorways. And when we had everything ready to go and we had things cleared, we'd bring Michael out on, we'd roll the cameras, he'd do a shot, and he'd have to disappear. And if we had to have take two, it was liable to be a long time because people flipped out when they saw him. It's just the way it was. And the film itself, as you said, went through changes, went through an evolution. I think the hard part for Michael, that's a pretty big stretch for him in the midst of this all-American boy from Family Ties and Back to the Future, now coming across as a coke-snorting party guy with a lot of problems. That's really ultra simplistic, but that's hard.
Yeah, and I wonder, was the reception of the film good? Did audiences take Michael J. Fox as a darker character who was struggling with drugs, or was that ever a consideration even for the filmmakers?
For me, that's a big stretch for Michael, because to get audiences to actually believe his character, because he's so prominent, he's so obviously Michael Fox. I thought that was very difficult. I can understand in the film he was, automatic box office. But I think it was very difficult. I'm not sure audiences understood that. And the book is, when you read the book, it's very difficult to see Michael in that book. Yeah. In the film, maybe easier to see it. And honestly, I don't think I ever saw it in a theater with an audience. And I think I went right onto something else and kind of lost track of it until it came out. And I don't remember it doing that well. But when I haven't seen it recently either, but I'd like to, because there were some good things in it, and it had Phoebe Cates. She's a luminous being, right? And she's a wonderful, down to earth, female, and I'd always thought she was just like unreal. And I sort of found out she was in the movie, I couldn't sleep. I was just like, oh my God. Well, she wasn't really in it that much. She just kind of walk through. Maybe it wasn't even the right part for her, but I got to meet Phoebe Cates, and she was who we'd heard she was. And her, I think she was married to, anyway, she was married, and they fit together. You could see it. They were great.
Another great actress in there as well, Diane Wiest, who is one of my favorites, and who it's by
and so right on, wonderful woman. So good at what she did, made it look so easy. Oh my goodness. Just like, how do they do that? How do actors do that? You see some actors winding up for days for something, and that's one way. And then you see other actors they don't do anything. They just walk in, get on their mark, and this person comes out, this other person. I constantly was blown away by people like that. Diane Wiest is one of them. Yeah.
And also, I think it's one of those films that you can, because it's Gordon Willis, perhaps, you can pause it at any stage, and it's an amazing frame. It's an amazing piece of art just to look at the photography, and what was Gordon Willis like as a DP? Was he a perfectionist? Was he... How did he achieve these amazing images?
Okay, here's Gordon Willis. You know how he lights. He lights in a very specific... Once Gordon Willis came in, Dickie Quinn was in heaven, because he knew what Gordon was going to want. He knew how to light the way Gordon wanted, and that just was never even in the conversation. That just happened. But what Gordon would also do, he brought in his own camera operator. And what he would do is sit on the camera. And at every stage in the rehearsal, he had a specific crosshairs in the viewfinder had to be. And he would rehearse with his operator where that was in the shot at all times. And he was extremely specific. I never actually ever saw anybody more specific than that. And this guy was a good operator on his own, but he was also very good at understanding how Gordon was and what Gordon wanted, and gave Gordon what he wanted. And so they worked very, very well together. I can't remember the operator's name, but he was this wonderful, basically invisible man who carried a tremendous load that none of us had to worry about, that Gordon had to know was right. And it all came down to this guy. So yes, Gordon was very specific and was very tough about it and didn't want to pussyfoot around with stuff. And if somebody came up with another idea, he wasn't kind in the way he told them that wasn't exactly what was needed for the shot. He let them know that this was the way it was, and the reason that it was, and if they couldn't figure out a better reason, then just figure out that that's what he wanted. And Jim Brooks was always good with that. I remember in like the third day working with Jim Brooks, he came to me. It was one of the nicest compliments that I'd ever gotten. He just came to me and stood beside me one day. He said, "Where have you been all my life?" And I just thought, well, that was nice. He's cool. It was very nice.
That's brilliant. I do have to ask as well about, you did a couple of movies with Willie Nelson, of which I'm a big fan, Honeysuckle Rose and Songwriter. And one of them was with Alan Rudolph, who I'm going to bring up again with Made in Heaven. But tell me about those two films, because they're both music oriented.
Well, they were both Willie Nelson films, right? They were both very close to who Willie is in lots of ways. So the first film, I didn't realize until recently that Sydney Pollack produced Honeysuckle Rose. I never even met him on the film. He was never there. I'd never met Jerry Schatzberg before. And Robbie Mueller was the cameraman. He used to be Wim Wenders' cameraman. And so I just before we get into Willie, I remember riding with Robbie, who was a wonderful guy. I think he was Dutch. I'm not sure, but he was a really cool guy. And first film in America, and he was just blown away by everything having to do with American production. And the house we were filming at, the main house in the film, was in a little valley, so that when you rode out to it from our production office in our hotel, you came over this little rise, and then you would see the whole spread of the homestead down below. Well, I was with Robbie in the van when we're riding out the first morning of shooting, and we come over this rise, and all the production trucks are there, and the camera trucks, and the trailers, and Robbie, he says, "Oh my God," he said, "I have never seen anything like this. Oh my God." He couldn't believe it. And when we got to talking, I got to know him better. He said, "We used to shoot out of an Econoline van when I was doing features." He said, "We carried everything in an Econoline van." And I said, "Oh, now I get it." I said, he said, "Yeah, that's why." He said, I was not sure that I could keep going." He said, "I was very intimidated."
Wow. And
he was a terrific cameraman. But anyway, so Willie, he is such an enigma, Wayne. That is the key thing about him that I always come away with, what an enigma this man is. You can't lay a glove on him. He's personable, he's smart, he's funny, he's loose, he's fabulously talented, but it's really hard to get into where he lives. That's very guarded. I think probably for good reason. I understand it. My gosh, the crush of people around him all the time is amazing. And people think that, he's the guy next door. I mean, obviously, he's like them. So why wouldn't you just walk up and talk to him and tell him your life story? He has that kind of affability about him that's rare. So yeah, I loved him, but I didn't know who he was. I'd listened to his music, and I'd heard about him from Ron Squarey, because Ron Squarey had worked with him on Electric Horseman. So I had kind of an idea.
Yeah.
But so, I observed, my job, right? So I get to see these people working. So he's working with Diane Cannon, right? And he doesn't know acting technique or hitting a mark or something. And sometimes he'd disappear between takes and come back and be a little more spacious, than he was before he left. But it all kind of seemed to work. But the thing that also got me was his band, the people around him. Those guys were all so smart, and they all knew each other so well and carried off what they did behind the scenes so beautifully to keep Willie out there, but unencumbered, in ways that you rarely see. Personable, wonderful people, crazy as hell, but it didn't matter, it just didn't matter. They were so cool. But so Willie and I didn't actually strike up what you would call a personal relationship on Honeysuckle Rose that much. And by the end, we were able to chat a little bit, but I always left him alone. I respected who he was. He was overwhelmed enough. By songwriter, we had a different relationship. I turned into a runner by then. I was running every day, and Willie was training for a marathon. I think he actually ran one too, which to me, I was like, "You're training for a marathon? Wow!" But so we would go running every once in a while on lunch hours through neighborhoods where we were shooting. He just changed into shorts. His shorts were like a big Texas flag, the big star on one, and he'd have a couple of people run with him. And then I would go jogging with him, and we'd run through these neighborhoods, and people would come out of their houses and wave at him, and, "Hey, Willie, hey, man," like there was the guy living across the street, that is how he was wherever we went with him. And we'd take these jogs and we'd chat a little bit, but mostly we'd just jog. We'd just be together, blowing off whatever steam we had, and it would make us better for the afternoon. And then one day I discovered him playing a game of chess in his trailer. And I loved chess. I was obsessed by it when I was younger. And so I said, "Gosh, I had no idea you liked chess." I said, "We should play a game one day." And he'd go, "Yeah, okay, sure." And we did. We began, at first we had a couple of days early on, and we played a couple of games together. And we weren't competitive. It was none of that trash talk, or, we didn't do it that way. We just played chess. And it was cool because he was pretty good. And then we had to stop because it got too busy, and he was always busy anyway. And then the filming started. He was really busy, and I got busy. But then we came to a playhouse. It was a nightclub that he owned in Austin. I can't remember the name of it. The Grand Ole Opry House or something like that. And we had 2 sets of scenes we had to do there. So we're going to be there for quite a while, a week and a half or something. So I figured out that if I put a radio, one of the walkie-talkies from the show, in Willie's trailer, and he had a chessboard, and off in the corner of the set, I had a chessboard away from things a little bit. And, he would come over on my channel when he made a move, that we could play chess, and we didn't even have to be in the same room. So we did that for a while. And we'd play chess over the radio. "David, move my pawn to King 4. Okay, Willie, thanks, and then I'd run behind I'd be watching the setup, and I'd look at my scene, and I'd make a move, and I'd call it back to him. And that's how we played chess. Then we got these people that would come and watch every once in a while. They suddenly figured out what was going on. And then every once in a while, Willie's game would go, the strategy would disappear. And suddenly he would make a move. It was just like, why did he make that move? And I couldn't figure out any strategy behind it, and it kind of threw me. And until somebody said, well, you don't suppose they're passing them around one of those joints in the bus, do you? And I never found out for sure if that's what it was. But whenever he made a move like that, seemingly out of nowhere, I would call him and I'd say, you know, Willie, it just got real busy. Can we pick up this game tomorrow or maybe start another game later? And I'd do it that way and I'd close it out. And, you know, songwriter started out with a different director. Did you know that?
I didn't. Who was that?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember his name. And I can't. I think it was Steve Rast. And he wasn't working ever, not in the prep, not when we started shooting. And Sydney was producing songwriter. And Sydney waited and waited. And finally, it just was so apparent, you know, this guy just wasn't pulling it off. You know, so I was on both films that Sydney replaced the director on, you know, it's so odd. And I never went to him and said, look, Sydney, you gotta, you know, I don't, you know, I mean, if he asked me about it, I told him what I thought, but I didn't ever like go and undercut, you know, the director. But it was pretty apparent. So he said, okay, so I've got another director and I want you to come with me to the airport to meet him. You know, his name is Rudolph. And it rang a bell, you know, I'd heard of him before. And then I found out he'd been Altman's assistant director. That was one of the jobs he did early on. And so Sydney and I go to the airport to meet him. And Alan comes off the plane and walks over to Sydney and said, Sydney, I just want you to know, I am so glad to be here. I am so excited. He said, and you know, I know it's been rough up to now, but he said, everything's going to be great. This is a great script and everything is going to go great. And I watched Sydney's shoulders just, and that was my introduction to Alan Rudolph. The next day we were shooting at a location that was way out in the country, and it was the first scene that he was going to be directing. And he said, look, you know, I know it's a Sunday and you're not working. He said, but can you meet me out at the location? Maybe we could walk, you know, the set and like I could get the feel for it. I said, of course, you know, yes. And I gave him the map that the production was using. And it was just him and me, and I was driving in my car and he was going to go in his car. Well, he showed up like 45 minutes late and he was really pissed off because he said the map was bad. Well, the map wasn't bad. The crew got there. But I think he'd also gone for a ride in the country, and there he was in Texas, and he took a wrong turn. But anyway, so then we spent our first day together talking, and he was so regular and so funny and so cool. The guy was cool. He had style as a person. He was a writer. He could speak. He was funny. He was very intuitive. When he was talking to you, he wasn't talking to like whoever that body was in front of him. He's talking to you. He really was good that way. I remember just having an immediate affinity with him. And he made songwriter what it was. He just picked up songwriter and made it go. In spite of Rip Torn trying to leave in the middle of the night, did I ever tell you this? Rip Torn reported to the film. We went through a production meeting. It was one night before, I can't remember if it was the first night, but it was early in the film, and I couldn't sleep. And I got up and I was kind of walking down the hallway of the motel that we were all staying in. And one side of the hallway was rooms and the other side was a window out into the parking lot of the hotel. And as I was walking, I looked out the window and there was Rip Torn putting all his suitcases and all his piles of clothes in the back of his car. And, you know, I thought, well, God, that's, you know, what is that? And then Alan Rudolph comes out in his pajamas and they get into an argument in the parking lot. And then Alan turns and walks off and Rip starts unpacking his trunk. And I went back to bed and I asked Alan about the next day. I said, was that you in the parking lot? I mean, I knew damn well it was. He said, oh, you saw that? I said, yeah, I was having a little trouble sleeping. He said, he was trying to leave. He was going to leave.
Serious personalities on that show. I mean, you had Chris, Willie, you've Rip. I mean, how the hell did it go on?
and Leslie Ann Warren.
Yeah.
And they're all great. I mean, as weird as that sounds from Rip, and he did other weird things, when it was time to go and time to shoot, Rip showed up and Rip did what he did. I love the guy. I mean, a lot of people really don't like him. I've read, people say, oh yeah, Rip Torn's in it. And then people like start talking about Rip Torn, and man, he had a really rough reputation. Happily, in my naivete, I didn't know that when Rip showed up. So I just thought it was just another guy who was kind of had a little, quirky stuff going on. But he was great in the film. He did what needed to be done. He was wacky as hell in personal life, but I didn't really know about that. I loved him. And my crew and I had trouble keeping track of him. Chris Lloyd and Rip Torn were two people that were extremely hard to keep track of. They would disappear. What we said was that they had the gift of invisibility. They could vanish. But I loved them. But we always used to joke for years afterward when we were working on other films. I think I just saw Rip, because he would do that. You would think you saw him, but it wasn't him. Or anyway.
Fantastic. Yeah. And Rudolph, who you worked again on with Made in Heaven. I just love that film. I think it's visually one of my favorite films of that whole era, and it's severely underrated over here in particular. For some reason, it's never really.
Here too.
Haven't seen it on DVD over here. I don't see it kind of getting any kind of re-releases or showings. So it's kind of become, I don't know, in the States, it become this kind of a lost film of sorts. I mean, the only way I was able to get it was from the Warner Archives, which was the only way you could get a home video.
I don't have a copy of it. Can I borrow yours? So on Made in Heaven, Alan called me to do it with him, and I jumped at it. I was in Charleston, South Carolina, and the Old South. And when I say that, I mean the Old South was still alive in Charleston, South Carolina when we worked there. It was amazing. It was really like immersing yourself in another. The story, was kind of sweet in a very basic way. I mean, you fall in love with your ideal person in heaven, and then, earthly three-dimensional life comes along and short circuits everything. I liked the premise of that. I thought it was cool. I didn't understand how some of the scenes were worked out. I remember trying to figure out reasons that scenes went certain ways, because Deborah Winger and Tim Hutton were pretty. They wanted things a certain way, and they kind of gang up on them every once in a while. But I like the way the film went. I thought it was kind of sweet.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those films that's more. It's very much more like an experience. As you say, you're looking at some scenes, you're wondering, how does it work? It's not flowing logically. Obviously, there's not a whole logic there anyway. But like when it gets to the most frustrating part for me is the final scene, because it's this wonderful emotional build, and it's struck all the way throughout, and it ends very sudden, and it ends, with them just walking past each other down the street, and all of a sudden they realize they're made for each other. They're those two souls who are lost. And I was wondering, was there ever anything more to that? Was there more in the script, or was that always the ending? It just seemed very abrupt.
It did seem abrupt, and I can't remember honestly. We also had to at one point move from Charleston to Atlanta for the rest of the filming. So there was a lot of kind of wildly production involved stuff that kept intruding to the flow of the film, and I don't remember why it had it had other points in it too, that for some reason, suddenly something shifted and there was not a flow to how it shifted. It just shifted. And I had trouble tracking what that was. And I don't know whether it was a time constraint, a story constraint in the script. I don't remember. But I also remember Kelly McGillis was on that. And I always got along really good with her. She was I met her on Witness, and I was jogging then too. I started running when I was in my early 40s for self-protection. You know, I'd run on lunch hours, and it cleared my head and made me feel better. And so I started running in the preparation of Witness, and Kelly saw me leaving the hotel one day. She said, "Oh, do you run?" I said, "Yeah, what I call her." She said, "Oh, do you if I go running with you?" And I said, "No, let me get the car up front." And she said, "Okay, baby cakes." That's what she called me. "Okay, baby cakes, I'll be right back." And and we went jogging. That's how we were introduced here. So we went jogging in this giant field in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, nobody there. And we're just jogging and talking. Yeah. And so Kelly showed up. Kelly in Made in Heaven kind of got sidelined a little bit by the duo of Deborah and Tim Hutton. And I always felt that she was a bit constrained in what she was able to do with the part. But Alan, that was hard. That was a hard film for him. And I can't remember why, but it was kind of cumulative. There were script problems, there were location problems, there were travel, things that had to happen at certain points. So we had to leave places earlier than you wanted. We had to rush through a couple of things. But he always had this kind of equanimity about him, that was very conversational and cool. And every once in a while, he'd just completely lose it, but he'd walk off somewhere and stomp on the ground a little bit and then come back and it'd be all right. And I always wanted to work more because he was just a cool guy, a person. And if he was having a problem, it wasn't like the director's having a problem. It's like a friend of yours was having a problem that you wanted to help him with,
Absolutely. And it's very much the production design of the film. I always find was very striking, So and even there's the exterior shot of the house, which is out in the middle of nowhere. It's surrounded by gorgeous mountains, and that's the South Carolina location, is it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. Oh no, actually, wait a minute. Was that South Carolina? Yes, it was. It was
the dream house.
Yeah. It was great. I remember that now. Yeah.
Just even thinking of the scenes, the shots there now, it just gives me I always find it a very emotional film, but also it's a cumulative of everything. It's the production design, it's the kind of surreal quality which the cinematography has going on and all that, you know what I mean? And the performances, which Kelly McGillis I always find is kind of something, I don't mean in terms of her looks, but there's something dreamy about her. There's something about the way she kind of floats through the film,
Yeah.
As I say, a very underrated film, but one I hold very dear, and it's a shame that it's not more talked about, I find,
I love that you say that because, there are certain films that you work on that you rarely hear again, you rarely hear about. That is one of them. Bright Lights, Big City is another. I like Made in Heaven better than Bright Lights, Big City just because the theme appeals to me more. And also Alan's approach to it was, he was a big boy about accepting what was, even when it wasn't in line with what he had envisioned for the scene. That's a really hard thing for a director. And Alan was smart enough and mature enough to accept the limitations of where we were and how we had to be at that particular time, and actually make then what was left work for what he had actually envisioned for something more. Because I think really if he'd gotten to make it with the budget he needed and the things that he actually envisioned, it would have taken another giant step forward in not only the story, but also just the feel that it would have had. When you have a smaller budget, it's much more a parent is how to make what you envision actually get onto the screen. And Alan had challenges in that. I mean, you know, if you're working on Tootsie, you know, and you have a problem, that's one thing. If you're working on Made in Heaven and you have a problem, that's another. And actually both of them carrying off to become creditable films says something for Alan. And he had his own way of working, and it was not loose, but open, I guess, would be the thing that I admired about him so much. He was open. If you didn't have to just keep it to yourself and shut up because that wasn't, you know, what you were there for. Alan wanted to know about it. And if you saw something in one take that he was going to print and you said, well, did you see that part back there maybe wasn't working as well, we could make it? And he, oh, really? Oh, no, I didn't see that. What do you mean? And I, you know, and you go, oh, well, you know, let's do it again. You know, or I had an idea about this. What do you think? And he'd go, oh, that's interesting. Wow. I hadn't thought about that. You know, and that then brings something from the crew that also a lot of times is overlooked by people who are in charge, because crew people see a lot of stuff, and sometimes it's helpful. A lot of times it's not, but sometimes it is.
Yeah.
But Alan was open. That's what I liked.
So there was a couple of other films that I wanted to touch upon. For some reason, they just didn't hit at the box office, or they just haven't kind of, you know, lingered long in the cinematic consciousness. And one of those is Twilight, which I thought was a fantastic contemporary film noir. You know, and you had an amazing cast there. You had Paul Newman, James Garner, Gene Hackman, Susan Sarandon, Stockard Channing, and of course directed by Robert Benton, who had done some amazing work. Well,
first of all, the way I got to meet Robert Benton was through my best mentor, Michael Hausman. Michael had worked with Benton and I think Newman on a previous show. So he called me in to meet Benton. And Bob Benton, it's like your best next door neighbor. You know, I mean, the guy is so down to earth. And so you would never, ever pick him for a film director and a writer of his depth. So we got along right away. There was absolutely one of the easiest relationships I've ever jumped into on a film. And it helped that I knew Newman, and it helped that I knew Michael Hausman. And so I felt at home in the production right away. The cast of stars was so much fun. I mean, we had to stop all the time when we were filming so that we could ask James Garner, Paul, Susan Sarandon about some of the experiences they'd had, or they'd want to tell us a story. Something would come up that reminded them of a story that went on. So it was an extremely familial show in a way. It had a very down-to-earth feel to it. And Hackman, I mean, you know, he's always kind of dangerous seeming, you know, but when you get behind that, the guys just doesn't want to have any buttons pushed by people who don't know any better. But once you get to know him, it's really cool. And so but he was a little more standoffish than a lot of them. The filming was all in Los Angeles. A couple of wonderful experiences came out of that. And I can only talk for my personal thing. But when I started working, Paul called me from Connecticut. McGiffert, how are you? And I said, I'm fine. I'm good, Paul. You know, what's up? I knew by now I'd done a film that he directed with him, and I'd done Absence of Malice with him. So I understood that, you know, he doesn't just get on the phone to chit chat. So I knew right away there was something there that needed to be talked about. So I asked him, and I said, what's going on? How are you? He said, oh, I'm fine. He said, but you know, I'm going to be living in Malibu, and Benton tells me that, you know, we're going to do most of the filming on stages or on local locations in LA. And he said, you know, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind looking around for, because I have to have a Teamster take me to and from the set. I can't drive myself. And he said, I wonder if you could find someone suitable. And suitable from Paul Newman means capable, quick, an accomplished driver, and a no BS person, all wrapped up in a driver. And I said, oh, I'd love to try to help you. I'd love to try to help you find someone like that. So in my mind, as he was telling me this, I had this image of a guy that I met 3 years before on a film. Can't remember the film. His name was Eddie Worth, and he and I had racing in common. We loved racing, and that was how we established how we talked with each other. He was very shy, kind of diffident kind of guy, lanky, tall guy, very quiet, but he had one other quality about him that I knew would appeal to Paul. He was a championship-winning sprint car driver in the California Racing Association, which is one of the scariest, most competitive dog-eat-dog racing series on the planet. He was actually a champion. So I called the transportation captain on Twilight, and I said, look, Paul just asked me about getting him a driver. I know it's not my deal, it's your deal, but would you mind if I called this guy I have in mind? I think if we can get him, he might be really good for Paul. And he said, well, who do you have in mind? And I said, Eddie Worth. And he went, yeah. He said, that's good. He said, but Eddie's working on another show. And I said, okay, well, would you mind if I called Eddie and asked him if he'd be interested, number one, and if he is, and he doesn't mind, and you don't mind, talk to his transportation captain and see if he would let him go to come over to the show if I explain why. He said, okay. I called Eddie. I outlined it to Eddie, who hadn't talked to him in years. He didn't even know who I was at first. And by the time I got done, he was like, oh my God. He said, but I can't leave the show. He said, I promised this guy I'd do this show. And I said, well, what if I talk to your captain, would you? And he said, okay, yes, okay. I talked to his Teamster captain, and the guy immediately got what it was and immediately said, oh, that is the greatest thing. He said, yes, of course you can have Eddie, yes. And a couple of days before Newman arrived from Connecticut, Eddie Worth came to work on our show. It started a relationship between Paul and Eddie that lasted until Paul died 10 years later. Wow. After the movie, he and Eddie went everywhere together. Whether it was a movie, the racetrack, he went to all Paul's races with him. He was the head of a race team, and he was also racing himself still. And it became this friendship after 10 years. Yeah. And after 3 years later, I ran into him in an airport. We were both going somewhere. And I just was catching up with him. I said, how are you? How are things going? He said, you won't believe it. He said, when I met Paul, I was living on a little houseboat in Marina del Rey by myself. I thought the best years of my life were over. And he said, and then I came to work and met Paul. And he said, I didn't realize it, but he said, I'm having the best years of my life right now. So that was one thing. Yeah. It gets away from movies per se, but these are the kinds of things in film that happen that nobody talks about, that are also a part of why the film business is so cool, at least to me, yeah. And why I love it, because you strike up these relationships and sometimes they just have these wonderful carom shots that wind up in something good. Another time we were shooting at a house, the main house in the story for Twilight, and it had a big pool in the backyard. And because of the way the light changed back there, we had to put a giant silk over the whole swimming pool, which is a really big deal. And it had a lot of guys on ladders, and we had lifts in there, and the whole Grip and Electric crew was working on it. And I was inside doing something with Benton, and I came outside and there was nothing happening. I looked around the backyard and there were people standing around. They were all looking up. And Susan Sarandon was standing on the deck of the swimming pool, also looking up. So I came out and stood behind her, and I looked up, and this guy is talking about his first sexual experience as a teenager. And apparently Susan had come out and started asking all the grips and electricians would they tell her about their first experience with a girlfriend or a girl. And it didn't have to necessarily be sexual, but just what the experience was like of meeting a female for the first time that you fell in love with. And all these grips and electricians, all these tough guys with the sleeveless shirts and tattoos and stuff, and they're all talking about these girls that they met in high school or freshmen in college. And you know, and she's just there egging them on, you know, and we were like down for a half an hour while she's getting, and you know, you have to love this stuff, you know, where does that happen?
You mentioned about those kind of special relationships that occur, you know, during a career in movie production. Has there been any in particular that have been particularly close to your heart over the years? Any particular friendships that were made?
Friendships?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you too well. That I've made?
Yeah.
Well, Paul was one. I mean, he and Joanne are the godfather and godmother to our son. Yes, tons. And you know, you wind up getting very close with people for short periods of time. And then a lot of times you never see them again. Or you'll run across them haphazardly years later and instantly you pick up where you left off. I was always busy on a set. You don't get to stop very much. Even lunch hours, you know, you're doing the call sheet or you're fielding stuff, you know, that has to happen. So I didn't get a chance to sit down and actually meet a lot of people. And after work, I was so blown out that I usually just went back to my hotel room and crashed. Or, you know, we'd go to the dailies and stuff like that. So a lot of my friendships were fleeting and fast that I had to pick up on the fly. But years later, I have now met some of these people and established wonderful relationships with them. I'm thinking specifically of a man named Don Sufel, who was a boom man on a lot of shows that I worked on. His sound mixer was Jeff Wexler. And the two of them were, I mean, he's Haskell Wexler's son. And the two of these guys, Don and Jeff, were on probably 4 shows that I did. And every time that they were on a show, you knew that the sound package was something you did not ever have to worry about, that they were totally self-sufficient. If they had a problem, they'd come to you in a low-key way. And they were the friendliest people. If you needed a place to duck in out of the storm, you know, you would go and talk with the sound guys for a few minutes and you'd be all calmed down. They had a big hand on it. Yeah, there were people like that I met that I loved. The DP on Twilight was a man named Piotr Sobocinski. And I don't know if you know of him. A lot of people don't. I think he was famous for filming something called Red. There was a series of Red, Blue, and something else. Do you know it?
3 colors, yeah.
Yes.
The 3 colors trilogy, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's where Benton and Michael Hausman heard of him. Michael Hausman was producing for Benton. This guy was, I loved him straight off. And we had nothing in common. And we got along so beautifully. And he would always come up to me and go, you don't know me. You don't know me. So don't try to tell me you know me, you know? And I'd go, well, you don't know me either, but you know, we have to get along. And but we built this beautiful relationship. He subsequently passed away a couple of years after Twilight ended. He was working in Vancouver and mistakenly took a double dose of his sleeping pills or something. He had a very hard time sleeping and passed away. But last year, I met his son, who was the little boy when Twilight was being filmed. I have pictures of him with us meeting Paul Newman, you know. And now I met him. He had just DP'd a very, very highly thought of show. In fact, I think they won an Oscar for the best foreign film. I'm not quite sure about that, and I can't remember the title off the top of my head. But I found out he was in Los Angeles, and I just texted him on Facebook, and we met. And then he, do you want to come and see my movie? I'm showing it out at the Malibu Cinema Festival or the Cinema Society, do you want to come with me when I show it, you know? And so I went with him, and we, you know, sat and watched his film. Beautiful film, beautifully shot, beautifully edited, beautifully crafted film. And so those are the kinds of things that have happened. And I think they do happen with a lot of people in the business like that.
Yeah.
If that answers your question.
Absolutely. And as I said, there's so many special artists working on Twilight. And then when it came out, it didn't, I read that it didn't recoup its box office. Was it a disappointment for it to have such talent on a show like that? And a great story and so well crafted film, for it to not find an audience that, you know, it was the wrong era for it, I guess.
Well, I think it speaks to a larger question, which is every film you work on, no matter how good or how bad the script seems to be, you never know what you have. You never know, for so many different reasons. It could be performance. It could be the way the editing went. It could be the story had holes in it. It could be that it's not promoted. There are lots of reasons. So it didn't change my opinion of Twilight, and it doesn't do any good to pine for the pictures that don't reach an audience, because there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to think to yourself, well, you know, that's something that people missed, number one, or number two, it just didn't hit a common tone that resulted in a big box office. And, you know, when I started film in the late 60s and early 70s, it wasn't all about box office. It was about making a good movie and getting something that you believed in out to an audience. And that is a big thing. We've been talking about things that changed over the arc of when I worked. That was a big thing that changed. It became a big business. And it became a big business for a lot of people who knew business but didn't know film. And I think that it's had a resulting impact on the kinds of things that are made nowadays. You know, they're all going for a big return on their money, which is what a business does, but it's not necessarily what an art form does. And cinema is an art form above and beyond anything.
Absolutely. And it would be very hard to imagine a film like Twilight even getting a cinema release these days, if it came out these days. But even, what was it, 97 it came out, you know, it felt when it came out that it was like something that would have flourished in the late 70s or even the early 80s.
That's true. It was dated. The pace was dated, I think. And I think the story was a little slow moving. And also it didn't punch up some of the parts, but I'm not trying to redirect it at all. And a lot of times when you're in the midst of it, you don't have a chance. I didn't have the chance to actually think about how the story was evolving and whether it was being told, because you're so busy just trying to get the elements that you need for the shots that are coming up, for the actors and the crew and the director to have what they need to, you know, do what the scene asks for. So sometimes in the midst of that, you don't get a chance to really think about, well, now is that the best way that scene could have been told? You know, that comes way later.
And another film I would put in that category of very good, very interesting work, but for some reason just haven't been as well remembered as other films. And one of those is Brainstorm, which very intriguing film in terms of the aesthetics. You know, I mean, the cinematography is very unusual. You know, it goes from widescreen to full frame Academy ratio, whatever it was, and you have these super wide lenses. So it's a visually stimulating film. Very interesting premise.
When that film started, I was not there. I was not hired originally. And apparently when they started, Doug had a hard time getting across to the crew and sometimes the cast what it was that he wanted the scenes to be about. He knew, but it was a little, there was some bump put on. I'm not quite sure what it was, but it wound up with the production going behind radically in the first 2 weeks of production. I got a call at like 5 a.m. from Jack Grossberg, the man who originally hired me on King Kong at Brian Frankish's behest. And Jack said, look, I've been asked to take over this film called Brainstorm. It's in South Carolina. It's being done by Doug Trumbull. It's got Chris Walken and Natalie Wood in it. And I need an AD to come with me. They're firing the AD and the UPM. And I'd like you, are you free? And I said, yeah. He said, will you go? And I said, yeah. And the next day we were on a plane. And within about a week, Jack's experience, his inclusiveness, his sense of humor, and his just his expertise at understanding personal problems as they came across in films. He had everybody on the right track, and he had a voice for Doug going on. Doug now had a platform to be able to talk about what he needed, because people had calmed down and could have understood what Doug was trying to do at the same time. And we got the film back on the tracks. I didn't have a lot of time to get to know anything about it except what Doug wanted and what he needed for the next shot and so on and so forth. At one point, I didn't have a chance to meet Chris and Natalie other than, hello, I'm glad to see you. Could you come to the set? We need you for this shot, kind of thing, until the company moved from Raleigh, North Carolina to Kitty Hawk to shoot some scenes at the Wright brothers monument there, a museum that went along with the ideas in the film of travel and discoveries of travel, right? So the real import of Brainstorm and the ideas behind it came to me slowly, because we didn't hit the technical aspects of what they were doing until we got back to the stages, and those scenes were filmed. And I was kind of reading the script in the order that it was coming up when we were shooting it. So things were a little spotty until I kind of got the hang of what was going on. But in amongst that was Natalie Wood doing the first film that she'd been involved in, I think, in a long time, because she had taken years away from filmmaking to become a mom, and she had 2 daughters, and she missed them very much. That was one thing I heard about immediately from the hair and makeup people who worked with her. She was having a hard time being away from her kids across the country. So there was that. And she was very worried about playing a relatively young woman, newlywed. So she was worried about it. And Chris Walken had this amazing ability to disarm all her fear and her questions about whether she was qualified, and would just bring her into these scenes together, do something crazy that would disarm her sensitivities and stuff and get her to laugh, and they would go into the scenes at that point, or he'd do something in the middle of a scene. And they had this relationship already when I got there after 2 weeks, that you could see it. You could tell there was this connection that they had made. And so they were also working together. If there were parts of the scenes that they didn't like or didn't understand, they would kind of team up against Doug, or at least as a positive opposition to try to come up with something better. But the thing that amazed me about it was, I think they were as surprised as anyone at their compatibility. And it was something that became extremely pronounced in subtle ways, but it was definitely there. I didn't get to know them and talk to them until we got out to Kitty Hawk. And then I got to talk with them a little bit between takes, and they were always together on the set. And example of what was going on then, Chris came to me one night, we were shooting into the evenings, and Chris came to me one night and said, hey, we want to leave and go to a restaurant that we saw. Natalie and I want to go have dinner. Is that okay? And I said, sure. I mean, what are you going to say? But could you take a radio from the set and and then I can call you when we're ready to go and give you enough time to get back and get ready. And would that be okay? And he said, sure. He kind of giggled, he said, okay, whatever. So about an hour and a half later, I called them. I said, hi, you guys, we're ready to go. And Natalie picked a walkie-talkie and said, David, we're not coming back. Sorry. And click. And of course, I was like, I didn't really know them. I didn't understand that she was joking. Quite. I mean, I sort of thought they can't do this, they wouldn't be. And then she came back on the phone. She was laughing. She said, we'll be right there. Sorry. Bye. And they came back and they were laughing and they'd had a glass of wine or something else. So they were feeling good, but they did the scenes fine. And so that carried through back to Los Angeles, that relationship. And for me, it became a big part of that film that I remember for obvious reasons.
Probably my favorite part of that film, apart from the aesthetic work, is their relationship. So that obviously explains their great chemistry on screen, and Christopher Walken in particular. We were talking earlier about Willie Nelson being this enigma of a person. And I've always found something of that in Christopher Walken as well. There's something very hard to describe about him. I mean, there's an element of, we also talked about Crispin Glover, who has this unique screen presence. And Christopher Walken has that in droves. What is it about Chris Walken? That unique screen presence. What is it? Is that him? Yeah. You can't take your eyes off him. It's whether it's on the screen or off. The guy has a mesmerizing quality about him. It's the way he moves, the way he talks, the way he looks at you or doesn't. I found him utterly fascinating. I have such a wonderful viewpoint from where I sit on a show. So I get a chance to see them when nobody else kind of busy, but when we're getting ready to do a shot, I have these beats where I can look over and watch as they get ready to do something, or after they've come off a shot and letting what they've been doing kind of drain out of them and stuff. So you get to see aspects of people in the way they are. Chris would just seamlessly, as he walked in to take his marks for a shot, would go into whatever character he was on. I only worked with him twice, but he was fascinating, and he was also he didn't go around trying to make friends with people. He was kind of standoffish. I don't know whether that was shy or just overwhelmingly busy and occupied with his part, as so often happens with actors, that nobody seems to realize, how difficult it is to walk around holding 2 pages of dialogue in your head, getting ready to go. So my first interaction with him as a person-to-person interaction was on Brainstorm in Raleigh. Been there about a week and a half, and I was looking over a big open office space, and the electricians and grips had hit a problem with something, and they're all running around, and a lot of guys doing stuff. And Chris, who had been in his trailer, I guess, came up behind me and stood for a minute behind me. I could sense him behind me, and he just kind of had his arms folded, and he was kind of looking around, and he said, so how's it going out there? And I said, I was frustrated and a little uptight because it was taking a lot of time. And I said, well, this is not what I would call like a fantastic A+ motion picture preparation. I would say this is more like welding right now. We're kind of welding. And Chris said, yeah. And he turned around and I heard him laughing as he was going away. He was chuckling to himself as he walked away. And, we had other interactions through the film, and every time that something was going on, he'd come up and ask me how we were doing. And I'd either tell him, well, we're doing well, we'll be ready in a minute, or we're welding. And Chris always knew that meant it was going to be another 10 or 15 minutes, and he would immediately leave. And that became our shorthand. And then I met him on Batman Returns again, and we didn't talk very much because we were all busy on that film. That film took up half of Warner Brothers when we were shooting, took up half the stage space. And that's on 62 acres of stages. So anyway, but he was sitting on the set in his chair as Shrek, this horrible man in the film,
waiting for something to begin, and the electricians were working around him, and he was kind of watching them work and waiting and waiting for them to get, and we happened to lock eyes. I was standing in the back of the set, and he looked over at me, and he just went, welding. He was mouthing welding, and I just nodded, and that was how we communicated. But he was dear to Natalie Wood, dear. He really helped her. It annoyed a lot of the people on the set because he'd do something weird and we'd have to go down for 2 minutes while Natalie stopped laughing, because she'd just like lose it. But it was so fun to watch her lose it. Here's this. Yeah, she was a wonderful woman. I mean, not like I wanted to date her kind of thing. She was just a wonderful, luminous being, what I call people like that. And she was that kind of person. She was dear. And she was also responsible, caring, knew that her presence on a set meant that everybody was going to key off her. So what she did would become allowable. So she made sure that she was on time, ready, and any problems that she had, she came into the set. But Chris knew what she was worried about, and Doug understood what she was worried about. And I think that Chris helped her a lot on that. And I think Doug did too, in that he was very patient with a lot of the goings on that they had going back and forth. Doug really knew what he wanted, but it was a very difficult concept to get across, both visually and with the dialogue and the scene setups, and still have a story going on of the villainous undertones that were going on. So I thought it was a pretty challenging film. When Natalie died on that Thanksgiving weekend, they shut the show down. And I remember there's a whole story that goes along with that, but basically I'd been away for the weekend visiting my mother up north, and I came back. I didn't hear the news. I didn't listen to the news, but I turned on my answering machine when I got back to the apartment, and the tape went all the way down to the end. It was one of those ones, a little cassette tape. So I thought, the stupid machine hung, and it just ran out the tape. So I ran it back, and I thought maybe it had one message on it or something. It was full of people calling about Natalie and her death. And they were just people crying on the phone, screaming, just so disoriented. I just sat there for 20 minutes and listened to people and people's anguish on the phone. That's how I found out about it. I went into the studio the next morning, Monday morning, and the first call I got was from the head of the studio saying, make me a list right now of every scene that we can finish without Natalie, and every scene that we'll lay on or a double. I have to see whether we can finish. We click. And that was what was going on. I was in an office full of people crying. So they had to shut the show down for a while. I had another film that I had to go on, so I had to leave. And I called Brian Frankish, and Brian Frankish and Jack knew each other. So Brian Frankish came in and took over the last fifth of the show, maybe, and finished it up as I wanted something else. I always wish the Brainstorm had done better, because it had great concepts in it, and it had great visual concepts in it that helped get the story across so powerfully in that time. But again, as you say, it didn't reach an audience. And if it did, a lot of it had to do with it being Natalie's last film, and kind of blunted, some of the story and the movie itself, unfortunately.
You mentioned there Batman Returns.
I got a call. Would I be interested in interviewing with Tim Burton? Could I come to Warner Brothers? And of course, I was like, I'll be there in 15 minutes. They said, no, tomorrow. And I walked into his office, and he was standing. He's real tall and lanky, and he was like, oh, hey. And we got talking, and we were just standing in the middle of the room talking. And then he went, and I thought he was going to go sit down on the couch. So I moved over to a chair that was adjacent to the couch, and I was just getting ready to sit down, and Tim sat down on the floor. And and he said, "You don't mind, do you?" He said, I'm just more comfortable down here." And so I had my job interview sitting on the floor of Tim Burton's office with him. We were like literally lying on the ground like this, like two kids talking to each other. And that's how I got the job. And he, I've never heard anybody outline a scene like Tim does. I can't really do a good mimicking of it, but there would be times when he'd leave the set and we'd stand there for a minute after he left, and we'd look at each other and go, do you know what he just said then? And we're like, I'm not really sure. You know, it would happen sometimes. We call him back and go, "So Tim, do you mean we're like doing this?" You go, yeah. Okay, good. You know, but he was always enthusiastic. Even when he'd been up all night worrying about something, he was always enthusiastic, always right there for things. Loved these characters, you know, especially Danny DeVito. You know, Danny DeVito and he would just go crazy together, trying, you know, figuring out different things. And I loved the film. I mean, my favorite obviously was Michelle Pfeiffer because of what that did for women. I mean, what an image for women, you know, just like, don't mess with cats, you know. It was.
Given that it's coming after such a hugely successful film, is there more pressure on a project like that for you?
Yeah. I nearly got fired by one of the heads of Warner Brothers. We were working in a set where we had to have all the penguins. They had to be in refrigerated water. They had to be fed every 2 seconds. We had to refrigerate the whole set down to 40 degrees to keep everything cool for them. And because Tim wanted to see breath on people's breath in the atmosphere, because it was supposed to be winter time and we were shooting in the summer. So it was very difficult. And so between takes, we would turn on these gigantic air conditioners, and I can't describe them to you, but they were, you know, they'd go 15 feet high and 40 feet across, banks of air conditioners that would hit this giant set. And it was obviously incredibly loud. So I had radios given out to everybody on the crew who was working on the set. And every time we needed to talk to each other, you go over to the appropriate channel for the grips, the electric, the set deck, whatever it would be. So I would literally be standing in one place, talking on the radio, switching over, and I saw a group of people come in the stage door, and there were probably 6 or 7 of them, and they're all looking up at me. I'm standing on this raised platform, and I'm just talking to the radio, and I turned away from them to do something, talk to somebody. And when I turned back, 3 or 4 minutes later, they had gone. And Tim came in to the set about 15 minutes later, and he came running up the steps, and he go, "Hey man, how's it going?" And I said, "Good, you know, we're almost there." He said, "Everything's okay?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Okay, really?" I said, "What's up?" And he tells me that this entourage went into Tim's trailer and said that I was just standing around and I wasn't doing anything, and it was too expensive a set to be able to have someone just not doing anything, and that probably I should be fired. And that's when Tim came in. And I explained to him, I said, "Tim, we're all on radio. I don't have to run around. I've got everybody right here in my ear." And he went, "Oh, God. And he said, "Okay, call me when you're ready." And he ran downstairs. But what I didn't learn until, I can't remember, I think it was a day later, one of Tim's assistants had been in the trailer when that was going on. And he told me that Tim went back and told this guy from Warner Brothers, I don't want to say his name, that if he was going to fire me, that he would leave the show too. And so that immediately put a stop to it. I'd never had a director do that. I'd never actually been threatened to be fired much either, you know, and that just didn't happen. I was lucky, but to have him do that, how does that make you feel when you go to work for a guy like that? I love the film. It was a really hard film. I remember at the end of that, the crew people were so burnt out and so crazy, just so like we were just very edgy. that we used to, on the lunch hours, we had rope climbing rigs. Some of the grips had them. They were rock climbers, and they brought these rigs in, and anybody who wanted to would climb up into the perms, and the permanents in the top of the sets are like 50 feet above the ground, and rappel out of the perms down to the ground, and then run up again and get hooked up. They'd help you hook up, and you just be able to rappel down, and it gave you this feeling of a release, that you could let go some of the pressure. That's the point that it got to.
Yeah.
I want to tell you one more story about Batman. Do you remember the explosion in front of the department store, the Shrek department store? Well, there are two things about that are amazing for behind the scenes look. One is, when we got to do that special effects shot, the only people on the stage were Tim, me, Stefan Chomsky, the director of photography, some camera people, obviously the effects people somewhere, I don't even know where they were, and a stunt woman in a Catwoman rubber suit standing at the edge of the frame, who was told that, when the explosion got off, she had to pick her own timing to run out of the shot because it was going to be a big explosion. So we're all up basically in the perms, in a lower decking of the perm, the cameras, the wide shots, and we can see the whole storefront, and we can see the girl standing there. And suddenly someone comes in the door and says, "Hey, we hear that, oh gosh, who does it? Danny Elfman. We heard Danny Elfman is hiding in the perms because he loves explosions." And Tim goes, "What?" And I said, hold on. So I run up into the top perms, and they're all filled with spider webs. It's like a Halloween movie up there. It's like really weird. And I'm going, Danny, if you're up here, you need to go away. You need to come down. You need to get out of here. There's going to be a fireball that rolls up into the perms, and we don't know what's going to happen. And it's going to be really loud. Please, if you're here hiding, come out. Nothing moved. We figured he probably left. When we went to do the shot, we called the shot, we rolled the cameras, we called action. The store blew up, and the girl ran out of frame, and Tim went, and we said, what? He said, she left too soon. You can't see much of the explosion yet, and she's gone. And everybody was kind of down on her for that, thinking she panicked and left too soon. So that's the first piece. The second piece is the rest of the crew was standing outside the stage waiting for the shot to be over. And those sets, the big sound stages at Universal and Warner Brothers and stuff, have very thick stage walls. It takes a couple of people to roll them open and close, and the stage doors obviously were closed. And they said when that explosion went off inside, that the stage doors bowed from the explosion, right? And our ears are ringing. My ears are ringing for like a couple of days from it. But that's how powerful the explosion was in there. So that was the last explosion Warner Brothers ever allowed on their stages. It was too big. It was too powerful. A fireball did roll up into the perms. It started a few little tiny fires that went out for catching the spider webs on fire and stuff. 2 days later, we're getting ready to do a shot, and to get to the shot, we have to roll on video past the wide shot of the girl and the store. And Tim and I we're looking at the monitor as it goes by. And Tim goes, wait, play that again. And so we play the video tap of the explosion on the set with the girl. And as the video is rolling, you never saw it with the naked eye, you never saw it on film, but when you see video, you actually saw the heat waves radiating off this girl's rubber suit.
Oh my God.
And when I talked to her after, I said, I can't remember her name, but I said, what do you think might have happened? She said, I had to go. I said, that suit would have melted on me, I think. And I said, really? Are you? She said, I can't explain to you. She said, it just suddenly got incredibly hot. on the video, you could see what she ran. Tim Winter and personally apologized. He said, "I'm so sorry." He said, "I did not understand." She said, it was scary.
And a good job that Nelson wasn't hiding up there in the perms.
Tim was really pissed off at him. I remember he was really mad at him. He wouldn't let him on the set for like a really long time. He like punished him.
Oh my God.
But you know.
Yeah. And of course, another film that I have to bring up is Vanilla Sky. You know, Cameron Crowe, one of his best films. And I think it's one of the great modern American films that, you know, that it's the closest thing to something of a Buñuel or a Godard film that will get from the major Hollywood studios at this period in cinema. You know, a very intricately plotted film, wonderfully surreal and kind of avant-garde. As I say, it's not the kind of thing that you would see in Hollywood around this time. And it made me think of another film that Tom Cruise did. I think of these two as being those kind of outliers in Hollywood at the time. And that the other one is Eyes Wide Shut, which I think is an absolute masterpiece. I'm sure many
Which was it?
Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh God, yeah.
You know, which
Sydney was on that.
That's right. Yeah, and I think it's one of my favorite films of all time. And it got a lot of people, I think, it was probably mismarketed as this kind of erotic thriller, which it's not. You know, but Vanilla Sky, I think, is up there with that as something that's it's different. It's very artistic. It's avant-garde. It's experimental, but packaged in such an easily consumable way as well. Because you have beautiful stars, a great soundtrack, and wonderfully directed. So tell me how you came to Vanilla Sky.
I will, but first, as an addition to what you were describing, also incredibly open interpretation.
Yeah.
I mean, of all the films I've done, I'm not sure I ever worked on a film that had more possibilities to it, more layering to it, more, no, that's not what it was about. It was about this. You'd have people actually, arguing about what was going on in the film. And there were times on the crew when people would come up and go, do you know what this scene is about? And we were actually mixed up sometimes. We couldn't quite tell what was the scene portraying, wait. It was very funny. So Cameron Crowe is all he has been represented as. He is a heartfelt person. I love him. I really do, unequivocally. And he's also so deep into what he's doing. He would always play music on the set. He and Peter Weir would always play music on the set. And he was always very upbeat about what was going on, very excited about it, and imbued us with that excitement and enthusiasm. And he and Tom got along great. He and John Toll got along great. John Toll, I have to tell you a story about John Toll at this point. But so I met Cameron a job interview in his office, and we sat there and talked for 25 minutes or something. And we talked about both of us working with Tom before. And the night before the interview, I was very excited, of course, and I had a hard time sleeping. And I remember waking up at one point in the middle of the night and going, I've got to remember to tell Cameron that. I had this thought in my head that I have to remember to tell him, because it's very important. How dreams take a much stronger weight sometimes when you first wake up than they actually are in reality. But this was very important to me. But I immediately fell asleep, and the next morning I couldn't remember what it was. And I went to leave the meeting afterward, and he was very, we got along well, we talked well. He was very warm, very relaxed, but he was looking at me in a way that he wasn't really listening to my words. It was like he was just kind of sensing me in a way. It was kind of funny. But I remember remarking on it to myself, he's looking at me in a way that isn't really in conversation. It's like something more is going on. And I left the interview, and he was very neutral about, well, okay, good. I'll call you in the morning. Great. Nice to meet you. And I felt good when I left. But as I was walking in my car, I suddenly remembered what it was that I wanted to tell him. And it was so powerful that I turned around and walked right back into the office, asked to go back to talk to Cameron. I had to wait for 5 minutes. He was on the phone with somebody, and I went up and I said, I have to tell you this one thing that I forgot to tell you. I want you to know that I've worked with Tom. I respect Tom, but if I work on the film with you, I work for you. I work with you. And that's important that I get that across to you. I just really wanted you to know that. And, you know, Wayne has changed. And he went, oh, cool. And I've never asked him to this day whether that was something that made a difference to him or not. But I felt better when I left, and I got to work with him. We got along really good. I mean, we were like two friends who'd known each other. It was never the director talking to the AD. He was always like, "Hey, man, you know, what do you think if we, you know, if we try?" You know, he'd have all these ideas and stuff. And John Toll was always very like, we could do it. Could we just move over here a little bit? It might give you a little more of that. And you go, oh yeah, you know. So is that kind of collaboration? But have you seen the publicity shots of Cameron standing in a room with sheets of paper all over the floor? No. Have you ever seen that shot? I have to send it to you if I can find it. We were setting up a shot that it was Tom going through this paperwork that he had. And Cameron is standing in the middle of the floor, and literally it's as big as my living room here. And there were sheets of paper all over the floor. And Cameron is trying to figure out how to approach the shot. And he'd been standing there for probably 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. And I saw John Toll kind of, you know, we're looking over at each other, and the crew people are kind of, you know, we know he'll get to it, but, you know, it's been a while. So John Toll goes over to a table that has some props on it. It's in the background of the scene. And he has someone bring over a light, one of the electricians, and he takes the light and he turns it on this table and he starts focusing the barn doors on it, you know, and he puts a scrim in it. And he moves the light a little bit, and he starts playing with it. And Cameron notices him and gets intrigued with what he's doing. And John got Cameron to approach the scene through distracting him with another element of the scene that got Cameron way to then approach the part of the scene that he was talking about. And I just thought it was the most brilliant thing. And I knew he did it on purpose, you know. And I went to him after. I said, oh, you know, what were you doing? He said, well, you know, sometimes it's a help. Sometimes you get so locked into what you're trying to do, and he's got so many creative ideas going on that sometimes if you just distract him a little bit, it gives him another angle to look at it. He said, I learned this with another director I worked with. And I think Carol Ballard, a really interesting director, and John Toll worked with him a lot. And he said that's how he used to work with Ballard, because Ballard gets so hung up on something that John would start working on something and get him distracted, and then that would get him back into the scene. And he said, so I just decided maybe I could help him. And, you know, those are things that John's never going to talk about that, you know. Cameron is not going to talk about it because he didn't know that that's what was going on. And I'm not even sure I should actually talk about that, because these are things that are part of the subculture that go on, the subtext, the hidden part of filmmaking, but it's very much alive. These situations go on all the time.
The most interesting scenes in Vanilla Sky, I imagine, was a very complicated setup, which was shutting down Times Square.
I will tell you, first of all, when I read it, I thought that is going to be a fantastic special effects shot. Wow, you know, how impressive would that be? And then I found out that that was not going to be an impressive special effects shot. That was going to be, we were going to shoot it physically. And my heart froze. Because if you've ever stood in Times Square at any time, day or night, I mean, it's just it's the beehive of Manhattan. So right away, and Tom and and Cameron were adamant about this. This was not something that could change. Nobody could change their mind about this, and people tried. So we right away began planning for it. They hired a specific production manager who only handled Times Square and the businesses around Times Square, the contractual stuff that had to come out of that. And then we had meetings with the film office first, and then with the film office and Cameron and Tom and our production manager and people, we went to the mayor's office, the mayor's film office, and had meetings with them, explaining what we wanted to do. And of course, everybody, in the film office and the mayor's office, I'm not really sure we can do this. It's kind of a no, for good reason. But we worked and finally, I don't know how long it took, but time they gave us yes under these very strict provisions. It had to be a Sunday morning from, I think it was 6 to 10, and nothing could come on Times Square until 6, and everything had to be gone by 10 because everything was opening up on automatic, and Times Square would be alive again. So those were our guardrails. John Toll had an idea of, look, we don't have very much time on Times Square. Let's find a place where we can rehearse what we have to do with the crane and Tom's car and the camera move beforehand, so that when we go there, we know what we're doing. So the location people took the measurements of Times Square, where we needed to set things for what we had in mind, for what Cameron and John had in mind. And then we found this, I think it was a deserted parking lot in Brooklyn somewhere. And we went out there with the crane, with the car, with Tom, and everybody, basically. And we set out with cones where the car would start from, how it would come in, where the crane would be, where it was. The master was a guy on a Steadicam, bringing the car in and then backing onto the seat of a crane to be able to rise up in the same shot. And we rehearsed this for, I don't know, a couple of hours or something, until everybody kind of had the feel of how it would work. And so then on the Sunday that we shot, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, we hired 100 PAs to help us control the unbelievable amount of variables of where people could get into the shot, what streets they could come out of, doorways, subway exits and entrances. We'd set up tables with coffee on it just out of the shot, so that if people were trying to get somewhere, we had to hold them up when we were doing the shot. We would let them through when we were changing setup, but we had to hold them out, obviously, and they had coffee there, and all these PAs went out, and it was a very foggy morning, I remember, and I think it was in the winter too, so it was cold. And so these kids, they're kids, they're 18, 20, 22, want to work in film, and a PA, if you learn how to be a good PA, you can work in film. It's been the entryway for so many of us. And these kids were, some were very experienced, some were not, but they all did this. We could not have done the job without the lowest people on the totem pole who provided the greatest, protection for us. Always the way, hardly ever discussed. And then, then the film people came, the police came, we were all off to the side. Tom was in a 4x4 somewhere. And then, we're counting down the time, and boom, it's 6 o'clock. The trucks roll in, the crane rolls in, Tom runs in, I run in. We're all there. Everybody's running around. We set it all up. Tom and I are like right in the middle. We're not even thinking about everything going on around us. We're like, okay, man, I'm coming from there, and where do you want me to be? And we put down these marks. We talked about it and made sure it was okay with John Toll on the Steadicam, and yeah, they're okay. So then we're just talking, and he's like, if anybody in the film business loves a challenge, it's Tom. And this was a challenge, not like jumping off a building in Dubai. It still had his challenging moments, and he was excited. You could see it. His eyes were real bright, and he was talking real fast and stuff. And then we got ready to go, and Cameron liked what he saw on the monitors, and we got ready to do the shot, and we closed down Times Square. And there were nothing but a few pigeons down the block. I mean, I say this all the time. It's true. There was nobody. You couldn't see anything. And we rolled the cameras, and there were a couple of other cameras going, I think, too. And everybody's crowded around the monitors, all the police and the city people and the crew, and there's this giant cloud of people off in this little knot. And then I'm out there under the crane, watching the Steadicam, and I cue Tom in and count him down to the mark, and he hits it perfectly. He probably didn't even need me. And then telling him when to get out based on where the guy's moving on the crane, and as it starts to rise, start to run. And we, did the whole thing, and Tom runs for like 3 blocks, full blast. He's like a dot. And Cameron jumps up from behind the monitor and says, "That was so awesome!" And he calls cut. And everybody's like yelling, and it was very cool. It was very cool.
Yeah, and the film is very well remembered these days. And I presume, was it a success at the box office?
I think it was a modest success, and I think now. It is even more popular than it was then.
Yeah.
I remember reading some reviews of it where the reviewers were confused, but the audience didn't seem to be confused. There were people resonated with it, and resonated with the 2 relationships, with Cameron Diaz and Penelope, which was, there was some incredible acting in that film. Aside from the visual aspects and the idea aspects, there was some crazy acting going on in there.
Yeah, because it is a bold and daring film, as I say, for a major Hollywood studio at that time. And I think what's great about it is it has all those Cameron Crowe sensibilities that we associate with Say Anything and Singles and films like that, but it elevates them to new artistic levels, I think, and that's why I think it's one of his best films. It has all the things we love about Cameron Crowe, plus that bit extra. It's just a visually stunning film as well.
Truly, yes, I agree with you, and I think just raised it in the levels of possibility, of imagination, and stuff like that. It just put a whole other spin on it. But I do remember that every once in a while we'd all be confused about exactly what was this scene how was this gonna work? We couldn't.
Have you recall seeing the finished film for the first time?
I can't. I think it was at a crew screening, and I remember loving it. How could you not? It's for crew people to see a crew screening is different than somebody like a critic being called in to watch a screening. Because every scene that comes up, you not only the scene going on, but how you felt during the scene, what was going on behind you, who was having a rough day, who was being brilliant. So all that comes along with watching the film, and it's an extra added burden that I didn't always enjoy. I always like to watch them a couple of years later, when things were not so live in your memory, and it's not just bad things, but all the things having to do with it occlude actually what's on the screen. So I've seen it recently, and I love it. I remember all the good parts.
Do you go back often, or can you go back often to your films and just enjoy them as works of art, or entertainment?
Yes, I'm really lucky. I look at a film, I usually remember the good parts too that I lived through. Yes, I love them. I watched Tootsie and I recently watched Rain Man again. And they're all chunks of your life that you actually lived out, so they do have an impact every time you see them, even if they didn't turn out well. They always have a great resonance for people who are there.
Yeah. And of course you had cause to revisit them for a project that you were working on when we first met, and that project is now finished. Do you want to tell our viewers what that project is?
Sure, I'd love to. I working in film in 2004, mainly because my daughter became enamored of rhythmic gymnastics, which is with the ball and a hoop and clubs. It's a very hard sport. She was 7 years old when she decided she liked it. And I began taking her to her workouts. I didn't understand at the time that this was going to become a 12-year odyssey that this girl was going on. And after 12 years in a parent-funded sport, on my retirement, which was, I'm not a wealthy person by any stretch of the imagination, but this was something our family all decided to do to allow Natalie to chase this dream that she never talked about, and see what happened. And things kept happening. She kept doing well. And pretty soon they were flying her to Europe to see how she would do with the pressure. And then finally they asked her to be on the national team to try to get into the Olympics in Rio. And she wound up going to the Olympics. So that's the context. Meanwhile, Dad was driving her every day to the gym. And because before we moved to Illinois and the national team, it was a very long round trip. And it didn't do me any good to go home and then come back and get her because I'd be caught in rush hours and stuff. So I would stay at the gym with her. Well, by the end of a year of that, I realized that if I'm going to do this, and each year as she moved up in the levels of competition, the time she needed to spend at the gym was more. And it became, after 4 or 5 years, 6 days a week, 5 to 7 hours a day, 52 weeks a year. And so I was in the gym a lot. And I realized I better do something. I better do something for my body, and I better do something for my mind. I can't just sit there and look at my computer and the news and watch some girls work out. So I joined a gym, and then I thought, what's the thing that you could do here that would make a difference? And I always wanted my kids, who were too young to know why I was gone so many months on these films, why I loved what I did and what was it that I actually did. So I thought, well, I'll write down some things that I want to tell them that made me love film. So I began to write these stories. Well, that also went on for 12 years. And I actually just finished it about 6 months ago, but I still add to it. But it became a book that I'm calling The Best Seat in the House. And it's about experiences behind the scenes with what I went through in the film business. They're not tell-alls or things designed for drama. They're things that made me love what I did. They include interactions with people like Malice and Sydney Pollack and Peter Weir and Cameron and Tim Burton, and things I learned along the way about people, about myself, and about how films were made. I don't think I ever got through learning about that. I started knowing absolutely nothing. And so that's what it is. It's now about 73,000 words. And it's taken on a life of its own. I showed it to some friends who were in the business, and they said, well, why don't you try and get it published? Maybe people would like this. We like it. We understand what you're saying. So I hadn't thought about it that way, but now I'm trying to learn how to do that. Even now, when I think of some of them, they make me laugh, trying to find Rip Torn, when he disappeared from the set. These are wonderful experiences that you have. In the midst of shooting, they're terrifying sometimes, but when you think about them after, they're why you do it.
Yeah. I think for anybody who's enjoyed our conversation here tonight, it'll be an exceptional book for them because you go into much more detail on much more films than we could cover here. So
thank you.
I wish you the very best with it, and I look forward to having a copy. So
thank you for bringing it up.
No, you're very welcome. And just to wrap things up, looking back on your career the way we have, do any films stand out for you as being particularly special for any particular reason? Which ones linger in your memory?
Yeah, a lot of them, but I'll go fast. King Kong, because it was school. It was the biggest film school you can imagine. That's what I was told by Jack Grossberg. That's the truth. Brainstorm because of my undying love of Natalie Wood and what happened to her, and meeting Chris Walken and Doug Trumbull. And we named our daughter partially after Natalie. All the Back to the Futures because Bob Zemeckis actually made it, and Bob Gale actually made us feel like we could do that. We could actually go back to the future if we wanted, the way they set it out. And I loved the characterizations of Doc and Marty and Tom Wilson, Biff. They're just archetype people to me, and they live now so strongly. I loved Rain Man for obvious reasons, just approaching mental illness from that point of view, and growth of people. I guess those would be the standouts.
Thank you so much for talking to us tonight. It's been a fascinating and interesting career, and I just can't wait for the book, and I wish you the very best with it.
Thank you for helping me and asking me. I'm very complimented, Wayne. Thank you.